Good evening, and welcome back to the lamplight. There is nothing to do now but settle. Let the pillow take the whole weight of your head. Let your shoulders come down away from your ears the way they have been waiting to all day. If your feet are cold, tuck them in. If the room is bright, let your eyes close whenever they like, because from here on there is nothing to look at, only something to listen to. And it will go on quietly for a long while, whether you are awake for all of it or not. That is the arrangement between us. I will keep talking softly, and you are free to drift off at any point, and nothing will be missed, because nothing here is urgent. Tonight we are going to sit with one life from its very first minute to its very last. And it is a long life, and a strange one, and a gentle one to fall asleep inside. It belongs to a man who was born in a mountain village in the middle of a thunderstorm and who died alone in a hotel room on a winter morning in a city of 7 million people, and who between those 2 nights changed the way light arrives in almost every room on this planet, including, in all probability, the room you are lying in right now. His name was Nikola Tesla. Before we go back to the beginning, to the storm and the village and the small stone house with the mulberry tree, I want to take you to one particular afternoon in the middle of his life, because it is the moment that explains him better than any other, and because I do not want you to have to stay awake to reach it. Picture a business office in the 1890s. Dark wood, tall windows with the shutters half drawn against a hot afternoon, a green glass lamp on a desk, 2 men, one seated, one standing, and a set of papers between them on the blotter. The seated man is heavy-set and kindly, a manufacturer from Pittsburgh with a broad brow and a soft voice, and he has come north because his company is in trouble. He had bought, some years before, a bundle of patents from the standing man, patents for a way of sending electricity over long distances and turning it back into motion at the far end without a single spark. He had paid well for them. More importantly, he had agreed to pay a royalty, a small sum for every unit of power that ever flowed through the system, forever, and now the bankers who had come into his company were telling him that the royalty was impossible. It was a promise of such size that no lender would touch him while it stood. They wanted it gone. If it did not go, they would break the company apart and sell the pieces, and the man from Pittsburgh had come to say so honestly, because he was that kind of man, and to ask what could be done. The standing man was tall and painfully thin, with a long, pale face and dark, deep-set eyes, and black hair combed flat and parted exactly in the centre, and he wore gloves indoors. And he did not sit down. He listened all the way to the end without interrupting. Then he asked one question. He asked whether the man from Pittsburgh had believed in him when nobody else in the world had, when the whole weight of the electrical industry was arranged against them both, and the newspapers were printing that his machines were a dream and a danger. The man from Pittsburgh agreed that he had. And then, without any speech at all, the tall man picked up the contract from the blotter and tore it in half and tore the halves in half again, and let the pieces fall. Later, when accountants sat down with pencils and worked out what those torn pages would have been worth over the following decades, at a fraction of a cent for every horsepower of alternating current that has ever run through the wires of the world, the number they arrived at was $12 million, and some of them said that 12 million was a shy estimate, and that, the true figure, allowed to run to the end of the patents, would have been many times larger. He tore it up in an afternoon, and never once, in the 40-odd years he had left, spoke of it as a sacrifice. That is the man. Hold that picture, because everything else tonight will make sense against it. And hold one more picture beside it, gently, without any sadness, because we will come back to it at the very end. 46 years after that afternoon, on a cold morning in the first week of 1943, a maid at a hotel on 34th Street let herself into room 3327 with her passkey against the standing instruction on the door, because the sign asking not to be disturbed had been hanging there for 2 days and nobody had answered. The room was very tidy. There was a narrow bed, a desk, a chair, a stack of unopened mail, and a wire cage by the window. the man who had lit the modern world, who had held more than 300 patents in 26 countries, who had made lightning in a shed in the mountains and had bulbs glow in his bare hands in front of gasping audiences in London and Paris and New York, had died in his sleep at some point in the night, at 86 years old, owing several years of rent, and leaving an estate that consisted almost entirely of paper. Between those two moments, the torn contract and the tidy room, there is a story about a boy who saw flashes of light in the air, about a mother who could not read but who invented things with her hands, about a brother lost to a horse, about a walk in a park at sunset when a machine assembled itself whole inside a young man's head, about ditches dug in frozen mud for $2 a day, about a war fought with electricity and newspapers and cruelty, about a fire that took 12 years of work in one night, about a wooden tower on a bluff above the sea that was supposed to give the whole world free power and instead was pulled down for scrap, and about pigeons. Quite a lot about pigeons in the end. We will take it slowly, we will go year by year and room by room, and there is no test at the end, and no part of it requires you to remember anything at all. Let us go back to the mountains. In the far west of what was then the Austrian Empire, in the province of Lica, there is a high stony country of limestone ridges and thin grass and cold rivers that disappear into caves and come out again miles away, and in that country there is a village called Smiljan. It is a small place even now. Then, in the middle of the last century but one, it was a scattering of low houses with steep roofs, an orchard or two, a church, and a great deal of weather. The house we want stands a little apart, whitewashed, with a wooden porch and a big mulberry tree beside the door, and a wooden barn behind it. It belonged to the parish priest, and it is where, in the small hours between the 9th and the 10th of July in 1856, a thunderstorm broke directly over the roof. The family told the story afterwards the way families do, polishing it a little each time. The lightning was continuous. The thunder rolled from ridge to ridge and came back. The midwife, working by candlelight in the low bedroom, was frightened by the noise and said something about the child being born of the storm, and called him a child of darkness. And the mother, exhausted and quite calm, corrected her and said no, he would be a child of light. Whether that was said exactly so on that exact night hardly matters now. It has been said so often since that it has become part of him, and in any case it turned out to be true in the plainest possible way. He was the fourth of 5 children. There were 2 older sisters, Milka and Angelina, and an older brother, Dane, and later a younger sister, Marika. His father, Milutin, was a Serbian Orthodox priest, a serious, well-read man with a fine voice and a temper he kept mostly folded away, who wrote articles for the papers and poems he showed to nobody, and who possessed the peculiar habit of talking to himself in 2 voices. Argument and reply, so convincingly that guests in the next room would ask who else had arrived. He had a library, which in that place and that time was an extraordinary thing to have, and he guarded it and locked it, which we will come back to. His mother, Juka, is the more interesting of the 2, and Tesla himself said so all his life. She came from a long line of clergy on both sides, and she had begun as a girl to memorize long poems in order to have something in her head while her hands worked, because her hands were always working. She had lost her own mother early, taken over a household of small children at 8 years old, and never learned to read. She could recite thousands of lines of Serbian epic poetry and passages of scripture from memory, in order, without hesitating. And she made things. She built a mechanical egg beater from wood and metal scraps. She made looms and churns and small clever devices for the endless labour of a mountain household, and she made her own thread, and wove her own cloth, and sewed clothes so fine that the sisters at the local convent came to look at the stitching. Her son believed to the end of his days that whatever was unusual in his own mind had come out of her hands, and that if she had been born in another country in another century, she would have been remembered as an inventor of the first rank, instead of a woman who was very good at making do. He rose early all his life because she rose early. He worked to the point of collapse because she did. And she gave him the one thing that no school gave him, which was the notion that the objects of the world are not fixed, that a churn or a beater or a lamp is only somebody's guess, and that a better guess is always available to anyone patient enough to sit still and see it. The first years were happy in a way that was almost dangerously complete. The family kept horses and cattle and geese and a flock of pigeons in the barn, and the boy spent his days outside in a landscape of rock and water and enormous sky. He was a small, delicate, dreamy child with an unusual attachment to animals and an unusual quantity of ideas. He built a water wheel and floated it in the stream, a smooth disc with no blades, and was pleased for years afterward when he learned that a certain kind of modern turbine works on very nearly that principle. He caught frogs with a hook made from a bent bit of wire and taught the other village boys to do the same, and half emptied the pond. He made popguns from hollow stalks and hemp fibrae. He made a motor from June bugs, which is a story he told all his life with a shudder of comic horror. He glued 4 of the big insects to a light cross of wood mounted on a spindle, and their beating wings turned the spindle for hours on end, and he sat and watched his engine run on nothing but insect enthusiasm, until a visiting boy with a strong stomach sat down beside him and began eating the June bugs alive. One after another, and the inventor was so thoroughly and permanently sickened that he never touched one again for the rest of his life. There was also the crow. He and a friend used to raid nests, and one afternoon a crow he had annoyed followed him across a field, and there is a version of this story in which the bird actually knocked him off a wall. He liked birds already. Keep that in mind too, because at the far end of this life, when the laboratories and the lecture halls and the money are all gone, it is birds that are still there. When he was 5 years old, the completeness of that childhood broke. His brother Dane was 7 years older, and by every account in the family he was the extraordinary one. Dane had a memory that startled visiting priests, and a quickness that made adults stop talking and look at him. The parents expected everything of him, and one afternoon there was an accident with a horse. An Arabian the father had been given, a fine nervous animal, and Dane was thrown or was carried by the horse into a place he could not be carried out of. And he was brought home injured, and he died. The details were kept vague afterwards even inside the family, and the younger brother, who was 5, carried for the whole of his very long life a private conviction that he had somehow been part of it, that a door he had opened or a sound he had made had set the horse off. Nobody ever accused him. He accused himself, quietly, for 80 years. The house afterwards was not cruel to him, but it was changed in the way houses are changed. Whatever he did well was measured against what the other boy would have done. If he came home with a prize, the prize was taken in with a kind of sorrow. He said later, with no bitterness at all, that any praise he earned in that house was received as a reminder of what had been lost, and that this was one of the reasons he grew up needing to do things that nobody could measure against anything, because there was no comparison available for a machine that had never existed before. It was in the months after the accident that the strange thing began, the thing that shaped his whole method of working, and which he described, always calmly, as an affliction he eventually learnt to ride. Images began to appear in front of his eyes, not imagined images. Present ones, hanging in the air of the room, bright and detailed and unwanted, usually attached to something somebody had just said. If a word was spoken at the dinner table, the object that word named would appear before him, and would not go away when he moved his head, and would obscure the actual bread and the actual candle. Flashes of light came with them, sheets and streaks of light that filled the room. A doctor today would reach for a word or two, and probably for several. He had no word. He was a small boy in a mountain village who could not tell what was in the room from what was in his mind, and it terrified him, and it went on for years. The cure he invented for himself was, in a way, the most important invention of his life. He found that if he deliberately built another picture and held it steady, the unwanted one lost its grip. So he began taking journeys in his head. He constructed places he had never been, cities and countries and rooms, and he went to them at night, and he made friends there, and the journeys became so detailed and so continuous that he preferred them to the world. Over years, and this is the part that matters, he learned to hold a constructed object in front of his eyes with such stability that he could walk around it, take it apart, and put it back together. By adulthood, he could assemble a machine entirely in that inner space, run it, and, he insisted, leave it running for weeks and come back to find the bearings worn exactly where they would have worn in a real machine made of real metal. Whether that is literally true is something engineers have argued about ever since. What is certain is that he almost never made drawings before building, that he built very few models before building the final thing, and that his motors, when they were finally made in brass and iron and copper, worked the first time, which in that century was not normal, and is not especially normal now. The affliction had been converted into a workshop that fitted inside his skull and cost nothing to run. When he was 6 or so, the family moved from the village to the town of Gospic, where his father had been given a larger parish. The boy hated it. In Smiljan he had a stream and a barn and pigeons and rock and space. In Gospic he had streets and shoes and Sunday clothes and a great many adults who could see him. He described his early years there as the unhappiest of his life, and the reason is almost funny. He was made to attend church in good clothes, and to make himself useful, and one of his jobs was to ring the bells. One Sunday, coming down from the belfry in a hurry, he jumped and landed on the trailing hem of a wealthy lady's very expensive silk gown, and tore it clean away, and the congregation of a small provincial town had something to talk about for a year, and he was, for a while, the boy who ruined the dress. Not long afterwards the town acquired a fire engine, a hand-pumped machine with 16 men on the levers, and there was a public demonstration on the river bank with a band and a crowd and speeches. The men pumped. Nothing came out of the hose. They pumped harder. Still nothing. The officials went red. The boy, watching, thought about it for a moment, then walked down to the river, waded in with his good clothes on, and found the suction hose collapsed and folded under the water, and straightened it, and a fat jet of water came out of the nozzle and knocked over a portion of the dignitaries. He was carried back up the bank on people's shoulders. It was his first taste of the sensation of being right in public, and he never entirely lost his appetite for it. His schooling in Gospic was, on paper, unremarkable. In practice it was where he discovered that his mind did arithmetic in a way that other minds did not. Set a problem in multiplication, and the answer arrived before the writing hand could move. Teachers assumed cheating, because that is what teachers assume, and 1 or 2 of them made his life difficult about it. He also discovered the great forbidden pleasure of his life, which was reading. His father had that locked library, and he did not want the boy ruining his eyes and his health with novels, and so the boy waited until the house was asleep, stole candles or made his own tallow dips, plugged the keyhole and stuffed the gaps around the door with rags so that no light would show, and read from midnight until dawn, night after night, book after book. He read an enormous Hungarian novel about a village doctor which he claimed woke his will up, and he read Voltaire in a spasm of completeness that nearly finished him. Because when he learned that Voltaire had written 100 large volumes, he decided he would read all of them, and he did, and afterwards said that if he never saw another of those volumes again, it would be too soon. It was in these years that he began the strange program of self-government that he stuck to for the next 70 years. He decided that will was a muscle. He gave up things he wanted deliberately in order to prove he could, and then took them up again, and then gave them up again. Later this became a matter of cigars and coffee and cards, all of which he loved, and all of which he abandoned in mid-enjoyment, simply to demonstrate to himself that the decision was his. He calculated the volume of his soup before eating it. He counted his steps. He needed the number of everything he did to divide by 3. He would not touch a round object, could not bear the sight of pearls, and would not shake a hand if he could avoid it. Some of this came later, after certain illnesses, and some of it was there in Gospic already. It was all of a piece with the boy who had taught himself to hold an image steady in the air until it obeyed. Meanwhile, there was the future to argue about. His father intended him for the priesthood. It was the family trade on both sides, and had been for generations. And there was a place waiting. and a life of respect and moderate comfort in a country where respect and moderate comfort were not easy to come by. The son intended to be an engineer, and had intended it since a schoolmaster had brought some pieces of physical apparatus into a classroom in Gospic and demonstrated them, and a boy who had already built a water wheel with no blades watched a little machine turn and understood that there were people whose whole job was this. The argument was not shouted. It simply sat in the house for years, unresolved, and the son knew he was going to lose it, because sons in that place and time did. He finished the lower school at Gospic and was sent, at about the age of 13, east to the town of Karlovac to the higher real gymnasium to live with an aunt and uncle. Karlovac sits low, in the marshy angle where several rivers meet. And it was, in those years, a swamp town in summer, thick with mosquitoes and thick with malaria, and it also had a school with a physics laboratory. The aunt was a formidable woman, an officer's wife, thin and severe, who ran her household on the principle that the young are ruined by rich food, and she fed the growing boy on soup so thin, he wrote afterwards with great delicacy, that it barely deserved the name, in quantities that would not have kept a bird alive. He was hungry for 3 straight years. He also caught malaria, badly, and was fevered on and off through the whole course, and he still completed a 4-year programme in 3, because he could not stand to be there any longer than necessary. In the school laboratory there was equipment for demonstrating electricity and magnetism, and the professor of physics ran his classes with a showman's flair, and there, standing in a cold room in a swamp town, hungry, shaking with fever, watching sparks jump across a gap, the boy decided permanently what he was going to spend his life on. He had no idea yet what form it would take. He simply understood that this thing, this invisible force which could be made to leap and glow and turn a wheel, was the material his life was made of, the way stone is the material of a mason's life. He came home from Karlovac at 17, in the summer, thin as a rail and yellow with fever, and walked into a house where his father was waiting with a letter he had already written. There was cholera in Laika that year. It had come along the rivers and the roads, and the authorities were behaving as authorities did then, which is to say they were mostly hoping. The father's letter told the son to stay away from Gospic and go into the mountains and wait out the epidemic among the shepherds, and the son, being 17, ignored it, and came home, and within days he had cholera. He was ill for 9 months. He was bedridden most of that time, and there were at least 2 occasions when the family were told he would not last the night, and one of them when the doctors more or less put down their instruments. He grew so thin that people who came to sit with him said afterwards that he looked like something laid out already, and it was in the worst of it, in a low room with the shutters closed, that the argument about his future was finally settled, not by persuasion but by grief. His father came and sat beside the bed and said the things a father says, that he would get well, that he would go to the best school anywhere, and the son, who had been waiting for exactly this moment for 6 years, and who was not too ill to take it, answered that he might get better if his father would let him study engineering. And his father, who had lost 1 son already, said yes. He said he would send him to the finest technical institution in the world, and then he went out of the room, and the promise held, and the boy did in fact begin to recover, and always maintained afterwards with a straight face that it was a bean preparation recommended by a friend of the family that finally cured him. As soon as he was well enough to walk, he was sent up into the hills for a year, partly to build his strength, and partly to keep him out of the way of the army. Conscription was due. 3 years of it, and 3 years of drill would have finished what cholera started. So he went walking. He spent the better part of a year in the mountains of Laika with a bundle of books, sleeping rough, wandering with the flocks, dressed like a hunter, doing nothing but walking and reading and thinking. He came down at the end of it brown, upright, physically stronger than he had ever been, and full of an idea that would have made an engineer laugh out loud. He had been thinking about the ocean, and about how much power there is in the difference between water and air, and he had designed, in his head, a ring-shaped tube running round the equator of the earth, filled with water, driven by the sun in one hemisphere and cool in the other, turning turbines forever. He worked at it for weeks before he saw the flaw, which is that the energy has to come from somewhere and the sun was already accounted for. He also designed an aircraft that would not have flown, and a system for sending letters through pneumatic tubes under the sea, which nearly could have. They were the works of a 19-year-old with a phenomenal engine and no fuel of experience yet, and he was not embarrassed by any of them. In 1875 he went to Graz, in Austria, to the Polytechnic School, on a military frontier scholarship, and there he did something that has to be described carefully because it sounds like exaggeration. He worked, by his own account, from 3 in the morning until 11 at night, 7 days a week, holidays included, for a year. The professors wrote to his father to warn the man that his son was killing himself. He passed 9 examinations in his first year when 5 were required, and passed them with the highest grades available, and received a letter from the dean saying that his boy was a star of the first rank. He learned to speak and read a stack of languages, French, German, Italian, Hungarian, and later English, which he came to write in a way that no native speaker ever quite matches, elaborate and courteous and slightly strange. And in the second year, in a lecture room at Graz, the thing happened that set the direction of the next 15 years. The physics professor, a careful, dry, respected man, had received from Paris a new machine, a grammar dynamo, one of the first practical direct current machines, a horseshoe of a thing with a ring armature and a commutator. He demonstrated it to the class, running it as a generator, and then feeding current into it to run it as a motor, and as it ran, the commutator, the segmented copper ring where the brushes press against the spinning armature to flip the direction of the current at exactly the right instant, sparked, it sputtered and flashed, and threw off little fireworks the whole time. That was normal. Everybody accepted it. Brushes wore out, commutators burned, motors needed constant attention, and that was simply the price of turning electricity into motion. The student in the room did not accept it. He put his hand up and suggested that the machine ought to be built to run without a commutator at all, on alternating current, fed in directly. The professor stopped the lecture, and instead of moving on, he took the whole hour to explain, in detail, in front of everyone, why the young man was wrong. He explained that alternating current reverses its direction constantly, that it therefore has no fixed push, that a motor needs a steady shove in one direction, and that what had been proposed was equivalent to converting a steady pulling force into a rotary force, which was not a matter of difficulty, but of impossibility. He finished by saying that the student might as well try to build a machine driven by the force of gravity acting in a straight line, and that it was a grand idea and would never be done. He was one of the best teachers of his generation, and he was completely wrong, and he was wrong in front of the one person alive least able to let it go. It became an obsession, not a project, an obsession of the kind that eats sleep. For the next 6 years, in lecture rooms and lodging houses and on walks and in bed, the problem was always running somewhere in his head, a machine with no commutator, current that reverses, motion that does not. He tried arrangement after arrangement in that internal workshop. He knew it could be done because he could feel that it could be done, which is not an argument, and he could not show anybody why. Meanwhile, Graz went wrong. In the third year, the scholarship arrangements collapsed when the Military Frontier Authority was reorganized out of existence, and the money stopped. He had also, by then, discovered cards. He would say later, with the flat honesty he applied to himself, that it was never the money, that he gave winnings away and thought nothing of losses, but that he loved the play itself and could sit at a table for 2 days without eating. He gambled away his allowance, and then his tuition money, and then borrowed. He stopped attending. He did not sit his final examinations. He did not, contrary to what half the book said for a century, graduate from Graz at all. At the end of the third year he simply stopped, and told nobody at home, and left, and let his family believe for a while that he had drowned, because that was easier than writing the letter. He went to Maribor, in Slovenia, and got work as a draughtsman for a modest wage, and spent his evenings playing cards with the local men in the street. It lasted about a year. Then the police, having established that he had no residence permit, put him on a train and sent him home to Gospic, and he arrived back in the town of the torn silk gown as a failure, at 23, with nothing to show. What happened next was the hinge. His father, who had every right to be furious, was not, or if he was, he kept it away from the son, and instead began organising, writing to relatives, arranging money, trying to get the boy into the university at Prague. And in the middle of that effort, in April of 1879, Milutin Tesla died, quite suddenly, at 60 years old. The son was in the house. Whatever conversation might have eventually been had between them, about the priesthood, about the wasted year, about the brother, was not had. He went to Prague anyway, in the autumn of 1880, on money scraped together by two uncles, and he spent about a year there, attending lectures at the Charles Ferdinand University without formally matriculating, sitting in on philosophy and physics, reading in the libraries, and continuing the impossible motor in the back of his mind. Then that money ran out too. He was 24 years old, twice out of a university without a degree, fatherless, with no trade and no capital, and one single asset, which was a machine that did not exist, that he could see as clearly as he could see his own hand. An uncle wrote to say that a new telephone exchange was being organised in Budapest, the first in that part of the empire, and that a young man who understood such things might find a place. So in the beginning of 1881 he went down to Hungary, and arrived to find that the exchange was not built yet, was barely funded, and had no jobs in it. He took what there was, which was a draughtsman's stool at the Central Telegraph Office of the Hungarian government, and drew other people's ideas for a wage he described as miserable. He was overqualified, unhappy, unknown, and living in a city where he had one friend. Then his body gave out. What happened to him in Budapest in the winter and spring of that year is one of the strangest passages in the whole record of his life, and he wrote about it himself, with clinical detachment, years later. He suffered a complete nervous collapse, and its central feature was not weakness but sensitivity, cranked up past any level a person is built to tolerate. His hearing became so acute that he could hear a watch ticking 3 rooms away. A fly landing on a table in the room produced, he said, a dull thud in his ear. A carriage passing in the street several miles off shook his whole body. A train whistle 20 miles distant made the bench he sat on tremble. He had to have rubber pads placed under the legs of his bed to insulate it from the vibration of the earth. Sunlight felt like a blow. In the dark he could sense an object several feet away by a peculiar creeping feeling on his forehead. His pulse ran from very slow to 150 and back. His muscles twitched constantly. A doctor of good reputation examined him and said that medicine had no treatment for it, because medicine had never seen it, and privately told the family it was fatal. He was 25 and lay in a darkened room on a bed, standing on rubber, listening to the world thunder. And then, slowly, it passed. What brought him back was partly time and partly a man named Anthony Szigeti, an athlete, a big, cheerful, physically robust friend who did the only sensible thing, which was to get him outdoors and make him move. Szigeti walked him. Every day, further, made him exercise, made him eat, made him talk. And the strength came back with a strange bonus attached, because for the rest of his life he kept a portion of that sensitivity, an ear and an eye far better than other people's, and a capacity to detect things in a laboratory that his assistants simply could not perceive. He counted the illness afterwards as the price of the instrument. Now comes the afternoon. It was late February of 1882. He and Szigeti had walked out to the city park in Budapest at the end of the day, and the sun was going down, and he was in that particular state of health and joy that comes after a long illness, when the ordinary world seems freshly painted. He had been reciting poetry as they walked, which he did constantly and from memory, and on that evening it was a passage from the second part of Goethe's Faust. The lines about the setting sun, about how it retreats and the day is done, and how the poet wishes for wings to follow it forever, to keep it always in view, with the still world at his feet lit from below. He was saying those lines aloud, facing the sunset, in a public park when the idea arrived. It did not arrive in pieces. This is the thing everybody who tells this story emphasizes, because he emphasized it. It arrived whole, the way a building is suddenly there when you turn a corner. He saw the machine. He saw currents out of step with one another, 2 of them, or 3, arriving in separate windings arranged around a ring, each reaching its peak a fraction of a beat after the last, so that the magnetism itself walks around the circle, a field with no fixed direction, a whirlwind of magnetism, and inside it an iron rotor with nothing attached to it at all, no brushes, no commutator, no sparks, no wear, dragged around and around by a force that has no physical existence. 6 years of impossibility solved in the middle of a sentence about the sun. He stopped walking, and stood so still that his friend became alarmed and took hold of his arm and asked what was wrong. He is supposed to have said that he had it, that in a moment he would show what it was, and then he picked up a stick and began to draw diagrams in the dirt of the path. He drew the ring. He drew the windings. He drew the phases arriving one behind the other. He drew the machine he would patent 6 years later on the other side of an ocean, in a park in Budapest, in the dust, with a stick, at sunset, while his friend stood there not understanding a word of it. Then he went home, and for the next 2 months he lived in a fever of construction that took place entirely inside his own head. He did not build anything. He did not draw anything on paper. He simply added to it, night after night, until he had not one machine but a system. And this is the crucial thing to understand about what he did in 1882, because it is why the world's electricity looks the way it looks. He did not merely invent a motor, he invented an entire way of moving power, all of it interlocking. The generator that makes the multiple out-of-step currents. The transformers that step the pressure up for the journey and down again for use. The transmission lines that carry it at high pressure and low loss across 100 miles of countryside. And the motor at the far end that takes it back into motion with no sparks and nothing to wear out. Generator, transformer, line, motor, all of it one thought. He said afterwards that in those weeks he built and ran every one of them in his mind, altering and improving, and that when he finally came to build them in metal, the metal behaved exactly as the imaginary versions had. It is the largest single act of invention by one person that the electrical world contains, and he did all of it while working a poorly paid drawing job and eating badly in a rented room in Budapest, and told almost nobody. He also, in the same period, did the small practical work that got him noticed. The telephone exchange finally opened, and he worked on it, and he designed an improved amplifying device for it, essentially a telephone repeater, a piece of work good enough that a man in the Paris office of a certain expanding electrical company heard of it. And so the second chapter began. In the spring of 1882, at 26, with a system for the electrification of the planet stored in his head, and not one line of it on paper, he was offered a job in France, and he took it, and he went to Paris to work for the Continental Edison Company. It is worth pausing here to say what he was walking into, because it explains everything that follows. In 1882, the electrical world had exactly one commercial hero, and that hero was a self-taught American who had already given the world a phonograph, and was that very year opening the first commercial central power station in Manhattan. Thomas Alva Edison was 35, ferociously energetic, an organizer of men and money as much as a laboratory worker, and utterly committed, financially and personally, to direct current. Direct current is simple. It flows one way. It runs a lamp, it charges a battery, it is easy to think about. It has one crippling flaw, which is that at the low pressures safe for use in a house, it will not travel. Push it down a copper wire and it turns into heat in the wire, and after half a mile or so there is nothing left. Edison's own answer to that was to accept it, and to plan a world with a small generating station every few streets burning coal in the middle of every neighbourhood, with copper mains as thick as a man's arm running under the pavement. He had built exactly such a station on Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan, and it worked, and it lit a district of offices and newspapers, and it made him the most famous inventor alive. It also meant that everything he owned, every patent and share and contract, depended on the world's staying direct current. Into the Paris office of that company walked a tall, thin Serbian with a Hungarian accent and a plan that made all of it obsolete. Paris agreed with him enormously. He was 26, healthy again, well paid for the first time in his life, and living in a city that was at that moment building electric light into its own legend. He worked at the company's works at Ivory, on the edge of the city, installing lighting plant and troubleshooting machines that had been badly made or badly installed, and he found that he was extremely good at it. He was a first-class practical engineer, which is not what people expect of a dreamer. He could look at a misbehaving dynamo and hear what was wrong with it. He swam in the Seine every morning at 5:30, walked to the works, worked until 8:30 at night, and spent the rest of the evening playing billiards with the American engineers and losing at cards. And he described that period afterwards with real fondness as a year of pure vigour. Among those Americans was a man named Charles Batchelor, an Englishman by birth, who was Edison's closest and most trusted assistant, a quiet, capable, decent person running the European end of the business. And Batchelor noticed the new man immediately, which is how when the company had a serious problem, they sent him to Strasbourg. The problem was this. A new lighting plant had been installed in a railway station in Strasbourg, then in German territory, and at the opening ceremony, with the Emperor of Germany present and a hall full of dignitaries, a short circuit in the wiring had blown out a section of the wall. The Germans were not amused, the contract was in jeopardy, the payment was being withheld, and somebody had to go and fix both the machinery and the diplomacy. He went in the winter of 1883 and stayed most of a year, patiently rewiring, patiently negotiating, patiently attending dinners. And in the hours he had to himself, he rented a small workshop across from the station and, for the first time in 18 months, began to build the machine from the park. He made the parts by hand or had them made by local craftsmen who had no idea what they were for. He wound the coils. He made the rotor an iron disc, and when it was ready he connected his little generator and set the out-of-step currents flowing and watched the disc begin to turn, standing free, touched by nothing, driven by a rotating field that existed nowhere except in the arrangement of the magnetism around it. He wrote afterwards that the sensation of watching it spin was beyond anything he could describe, and that it was the completion of 6 years of thinking. He tried to interest people in Strasbourg. A former mayor of the city took an interest and tried to raise money among the local merchants, and could not. Nobody could see what the spinning disc was for. He came back to Paris in the spring of 1884 with the working principle proved and a promise in his pocket. When he had gone to Strasbourg, he had been told, by responsible people in the company, that saving that contract would earn him a bonus of 25,000 francs, which was several years of his salary and enough to start on his own. He came back, and he went to the man who had promised it, who told him regretfully that the promise had been made by another department. He went to that department, who explained that only the administrator could authorize it. He went to the administrator, who explained that the matter belonged to the first man. He walked that circle several times before he understood that it was a circle, that the money had never existed, and that he was being managed. He resigned on the spot. It was, in a small way, the first performance of a routine his life would repeat about 6 times. Brilliant work, a promise, a polite evasion, and a young man walking out of the building rather than argue. Batchelor, who was decent, and who was on his way back to America to take charge of Edison's machine works in New York, told him to come too. He said that there was only one man in the world who would understand what he had built, and that the man was in New York, and he wrote him a letter of introduction. The famous version of that letter says that it contained one sentence, that Batchelor knew two great men, and the reader was one of them, and the bearer was the other. Whether the wording was quite so neat is uncertain. Something like it went into the young man's coat pocket. He sold most of what he owned, bought a ticket, and in June of 1884 he travelled to the coast to sail for America. The journey was a farce. His money, his ticket, and much of his luggage were stolen before he boarded. He argued his way onto the ship anyway, on the grounds that he could remember his ticket number, and because a berth happened to be unclaimed. There was a mutiny of some sort among the crew during the crossing, and he was involved in stopping it and came away with bruises. And so he arrived in New York Harbour on a summer morning, having crossed the Atlantic in steerage in a state of some disarray, and stepped ashore with, by his own accounting, 4 cents in his pocket, a few of his own poems, a set of calculations for a flying machine, and the letter. He walked up into the city and did not like it. He said later that what he had left in Europe was beautiful and artistic and fascinating in every way, and that what he found in America was a machine for making money, and that if he had not already been committed, he would have turned round on the spot. That mood lasted about a day. On his way to find the address on the letter, he passed a small shop where a foreman was swearing at a broken machine, and he stopped and repaired it, and was given $20 and thought better of the new world immediately. He presented himself to Edison the next morning. There is no reliable transcript of that meeting, but the shape of it is well attested. Edison was surrounded by people, was in the middle of everything at once, was not especially interested in European theory, and hired him because he could fix things. Almost immediately he proved the point in a spectacular way. The company had installed the lighting plant on a steamship, and it had failed, and the ship was tied up at the pier, costing money. And he was sent aboard and worked through the entire night, alone with the dynamos, and had the whole system running by daybreak. Walking home along the street at 5 in the morning, he met Edison and the works manager coming the other way, and reported that the ship's plant was fixed, and heard Edison say something to his manager about the Parisian keeping late hours. From that moment he was in. For the better part of a year he worked in the Edison Machine Works on Lower Manhattan, redesigning direct current dynamos, and he worked at a rate that startled even that famously sleepless establishment. 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months. He improved the standard machines out of all recognition, designed automatic controls that had not existed before, and, by his own account, produced 24 distinct designs of dynamo and regulator, all of which became the property of his employer, which was the arrangement, and which he did not dispute. And every so often he tried to talk to Edison about alternating current, and about a motor with no commutator, and every time he was waved off. Edison told him plainly that alternating current was a delusion, that there was no future in it, that people would not stand for it, and that his own direct current system was the only sound one. The two men were opposites in every dimension you can name. Edison ate at his desk, slept on benches, wore whatever he had on, and solved problems by trying 10,000 things in a row until one worked. The younger man dressed like a diplomat, ate alone at a set hour, and solved problems by sitting perfectly still. Edison said famously that genius was mostly perspiration. The other man remarked, more or less politely, that a little theory would have saved his employer about 90% of the perspiration, and that watching him hunt for a needle in a haystack by examining every straw in turn was a pitiable sight from someone who did not deserve to be pitied. They admired each other and did not like each other, and the arrangement was always going to end. It ended over money, or over a joke about money, depending on who is telling it. The works manager, or Edison himself, had offered a large sum, $50,000, if the new man could take the 24 standard dynamo types and redesign them properly, and he had done exactly that over months of 18-hour days, and when it was finished and installed and working. He asked for the $50,000, and the answer he received, delivered with a laugh in front of other people, was that he did not understand American humour. He was told he could have a raise of $10 a week instead. He resigned the same day, in the spring of 1885. He had been in America less than a year. Some historians think the $50,000 was never seriously offered, and that he took a workshop joke as a contract, which, given how literal he was and how bad he was at reading a room, is entirely possible. It hardly matters. He had learned the lesson that the empire of direct current would not build his motor, and would not let him build it either, and so he would have to find his own money. Finding money was the thing he was worst at in the world. What happened next was the worst year of his adult life. A group of investors approached him almost at once because his reputation in New York was already considerable and offered to set him up in his own company. He said yes with enormous relief and started describing the alternating current system, and they stopped him. They were not interested in a motor. Motors were speculative. What they wanted was arc lighting, the fizzing blue-white street lamps of the period, which was a proven business with municipal contracts attached to it. He swallowed it and did the work, and did it superbly. The Tesla Electric Light and Manufacturing Company was formed, with a works in Rahway in New Jersey, and he designed a genuinely superior arc lamp with an automatic regulator, and it won a contract to light the streets of that town, and it drew praise in the technical press, and he received his first American pittance. And then, having got what they wanted, the investors calmly removed him from his own company. They kept the patents, which were assigned to the company. They kept the works. They kept the name, which was his name. And they paid him off in a certificate of stock which was, from the moment it was handed over, worth nothing at all. In a company they proceeded to reorganize around him. He was 29 years old, and he was on the street in New York City in the winter of 1886, with no job, no pittance, no money, and a piece of paper. What he did then he never hid, and in fact told with something close to pride. He worked as a labourer. Through that winter and into the spring he dug ditches in Manhattan, in frozen mud, for $2 a day. Wearing out the fine clothes he had arrived in, he carried and shovelled beside men who had come off ships that year and spoke no English, and he was, by a distance, the most educated ditch digger in North America, holding several languages and a system of electrification in his head while breaking clay with a pick. He said afterwards that during that period the whole of his higher education, all those languages, all that mathematics, seemed to him a mockery, and that the physical pain of the work was nothing beside the mental pain of knowing what he was carrying and having no way to show it to anyone. There is a photograph of him from a couple of years earlier, dressed like a young man with prospects. There is nothing from that winter, and yet, again, it turned on a small human moment, as this life keeps doing. The foreman of the digging crew was a decent man who noticed that this particular labourer talked like a professor, and got the story out of him a piece at a time over the working day, and then, being decent, mentioned it to somebody he knew. And the somebody happened to be the superintendent of the Western Union Telegraph Company, and the superintendent listened, and understood roughly 1 word in 3, and understood enough. He brought in a lawyer and a businessman with capital, and in the spring of 1887 those men put up money to found the Tesla Electric Company, and rented laboratory space at 89 Liberty Street, in Lower Manhattan, 4 blocks from Edison's own downtown station, and told the tall Serbian to go and build whatever it was he had been describing in a ditch. He walked into that empty room in April, and by the end of the following winter he had built the modern world's electrical nervous system. It is astonishing how fast it went once he had a room and a lathe. He had been holding it, complete, for 5 years. He built the induction motor with its rotating field and its rotor that touched nothing. He built the polyphase generator, and the transformers, and the switching, and the whole apparatus for making, sending and using power as several currents marching out of step. Between October of 1887 and the following spring he filed a torrent of patent applications, and on the first day of May in 1888 the United States Patent Office issued 7 of them at once, the core patents of alternating current power covering the generator, the transformer, the transmission arrangement, and the motor. It is one of the most valuable single days of patent issue in the history of the country. He was 31. Word travelled fast in the small world of electrical engineering, and a professor at Cornell, a serious and respected figure, examined the machines and told the young man that he had done something remarkable and that he should present it properly. So on the 16th of May in 1888, in a lecture room at Columbia College, he stood up in front of the American Institute of Electrical Engineers and read a paper called, in the plain manner of the time, A New System of Alternate Current Motors and Transformers. He was nervous. He had not slept. He spoke for about an hour, describing the rotating field, and then he showed them. He set the machines running on the table in front of the audience, a generator feeding out of step currents into a motor with nothing touching the shaft, spinning smoothly and silently, without a single spark, reversing when he changed the connections. The room contained most of the senior electrical men in America, and every one of them had grown up accepting that motors sparked and burned and needed watching. They saw a machine that did not. The paper became, more or less immediately, one of the most famous documents in the field, and it is still read. In the audience that day, or reading the paper within days of it, was a manufacturer from Pittsburgh named George Westinghouse. Westinghouse deserves a moment of his own, because he is the other decent man in this story, and there are not many. He was 42, an inventor in his own right, who had made his first fortune before he was 25 by inventing the compressed air railway brake, a device that stopped trains killing people by the hundred and was made compulsory across the country. He was heavy, moustached, courteous, physically brave, and had a habit that was rare in the industry of that period, which was that he was interested in whether things were true. He had already bet on alternating current for lighting. He had bought the American rights to a European transformer, and he was distributing power at high pressure and stepping it down at the customer's premises, which meant one generating station could serve a whole town instead of a few streets. He had one enormous hole in his system. He had no motor. Alternating current would light a lamp beautifully, but it would not turn a wheel. And a power system that cannot run machinery is a lighting company, not an industry. He read the paper, sent his engineers to look, and came to New York himself and went to Liberty Street and stood in a small laboratory with a very tall, thin young man and watched a rotor spin with nothing touching it. And he did the thing that changed the world's wiring, which was that he offered to buy the lot. The terms have been argued over ever since because the figures moved around in later tellings, but the shape of the deal is not in dispute. Westinghouse paid a large lump sum in cash and notes for the patents, $60,000 in one common account, of which a portion was cash and the rest was stock in his company. He also agreed to a royalty on every horsepower of capacity the system ever produced, $2.50 for each one. And he engaged the inventor personally as a consultant at a good salary to come to Pittsburgh for a year and help his engineers turn the laboratory machines into products. For the first time in his life, at 32, the young man from Smiljan had money. The year in Pittsburgh was not a happy one, and it is instructive about him. He went out in the summer of 1888 and was given an office and a staff and the run of the works, and he was miserable within weeks. The engineers there were good men and they were not deferential, and they had their own opinions, and the argument that consumed the year was about frequency. Westinghouse's lighting system ran at a high number of cycles per second, 133 of them, which suited arc lamps and transformers and gave no visible flicker. The motor from the park in Budapest wanted something much slower, and he had settled on 60 cycles in the second, because at that speed the machine ran sweetly, and the iron behaved, and the whole system balanced. The Pittsburgh engineers did not want to rebuild their entire installed base of generators around a motor that barely existed yet. He would not compromise, because he had run the thing in his head for 5 years and knew exactly what it needed. There were months of stalemate, and he found the committee work unbearable, and eventually he gave up trying to persuade them and went home to New York with the year served and the argument apparently lost. He was right, and everybody found out he was right within a very few years, and the number he insisted on in that stubborn, unhappy year is the number that hums in the wiring of North America to this day. If you are in a house in the United States or Canada tonight, the electricity in the walls around you is reversing itself 60 times every second because a Serbian consultant would not back down in Pittsburgh in 1889. Much of the world settled on 50 instead, for reasons of its own, but the principle in both cases is his. And then, having sold his patents and served his year and gone home, he found that he had walked straight into a war. It was not a metaphor at the time. People called it the War of the Currents, and it ran for about 6 years, and it was fought with lawsuits, price-cutting, pamphlets, newspaper editorials, staged public demonstrations, and cruelty to animals, and it was the most vicious commercial fight of the age. On one side stood the direct current interests, with Edison's name and prestige and patents at their centre, and behind him the group of financiers who had built the Edison companies. On the other stood Westinghouse and alternating current. The technical case was, in truth, over before it began. Direct current at safe pressures could not travel more than a mile or so, and no transformer existed that could change its pressure, which meant a city of 1 million people would have required a generating station in every few blocks, coal carts in every street, and copper mains of a size the country did not possess. Alternating current could be pushed up to thousands of volts for the journey, sent 30 or 100 miles on a modest wire, and stepped back down to something safe at the door. Every engineer who did the arithmetic came out the same way. The direct current side could not win on arithmetic, so it fought on fear. The argument they chose was that high-pressure alternating current kills, which was, and is, perfectly true and completely beside the point, since the pressure at the customer's lamp is the same either way. But it made a story, and the story was pushed hard. Pamphlets were printed, with red covers, warning householders that a deadly current was to be strung over their streets. Newspapers printed accident stories with heavy emphasis on which system was involved. And then came the demonstrations, which are the part of this story that is genuinely difficult to sit with, so I will say what happened plainly and briefly, and then we will move on. Because this is a program for sleeping, and there is no need to dwell. A self-promoting engineer working in the direct current interest began touring with a portable generator and killing animals in front of audiences of reporters, to prove that alternating current was lethal. Stray dogs first, bought from local boys for $0.25 each, then calves, then a horse. Edison did not organise the tour and did not appear at it, but he permitted it to run out of laboratories associated with him, gave interviews supporting its conclusions, and provided technical help. The same men then involved themselves in the state of New York's search for a more humane method of execution, and lobbied successfully for an electric chair and made certain that it ran on alternating current, and quietly arranged for the machines to be obtained second-hand through intermediaries so that it would carry the rival's name. They even promoted a new verb for the process, built out of the rival's surname, in the hope that the public would come to speak of a criminal being executed with a word that sounded like the name of a manufacturer of lighting equipment. The first use of the chair, in 1890, went badly and horribly. Westinghouse, who had privately paid for the condemned man's legal appeal against the method, said afterwards, in disgust, that they would have done better with an axe. It did not work. Not because the public was fair-minded, but because arithmetic is patient. The technical societies were not fooled. The lighting contracts kept going to the side that could actually deliver light across a county, and in 1893 the argument ended in the most public possible way, with a fair. Chicago had been given the World's Columbian Exposition, a vast celebration of the 400th anniversary of a certain voyage, and it was to be built on the lakeshore as a temporary white city of colonnades and lagoons, and it was to be lit. Lit as nowhere on earth had ever been lit. 2 companies bid to do it. The General Electric interest, newly formed out of the Edison companies, bid to light the fair with direct current for something over $1.5 million, and then lowered it, and lowered it again. Westinghouse bid a little under $400,000 to do it with alternating current, which was less than the cost of the copper his rivals proposed to bury, and he won. there was one nasty obstacle. The rival owned the patent on the standard incandescent bulb and refused to supply a single one, and so Westinghouse's people had to design and manufacture, in a matter of months, a completely different double-stoppered bulb that did not infringe, and then make 250,000 of them by hand in a factory built for the purpose. They made them. On the 1st of May in 1893, the President of the United States pressed a golden key on a platform in Chicago, and 100,000 incandescent lamps came on at once across the lagoons and the colonnades and the arches, and the searchlights swung, and fountains lit from underneath rose in colours, and a crowd estimated in the hundreds of thousands stood in the warm dark and made a noise that people who were there remembered for the rest of their lives. It was, at that moment, the largest single display of electric light in the history of the world, more electricity than the entire city of Chicago was using outside the fairgrounds, and every watt of it came from 12 enormous alternating current generators built to a Serbian's patents, standing in a machinery hall that the public could walk through and look at. 27 million people came to that fair over 6 months, and a great many of them walked through that hall and stared at the machines, and then went home to towns with no electricity at all and started asking their councils why not. The war of the currents ended there, not with a verdict, but with 100,000 lamps. He had his own exhibit at the fair, a room of his own in the electricity building, and he used it in the way that was becoming his signature, which was showmanship of a high and strange order. He had phosphorescent signs glowing without wires, spelling out the names of famous scientists and of his beloved Serbian poet. He had a small egg of copper sitting on a table, which would stand up on its end and spin like a top when the field beneath it began to rotate, and which he called the Egg of Columbus, and which demonstrated the whole principle of his motor to people who could not read a diagram. And every so often, several times a day, he would step onto an insulated platform, take hold of the terminals of a high-frequency coil, and let 200,000 volts pass through his body while he stood there apparently unbothered, wreathed in a halo of soft blue fire, holding a lamp in his hand that lit itself with no wires attached to it. The crowds came in their thousands. The papers called him a wizard. He was 36 at the exact top of the world, and he had by then already gone considerably further into strange country than any of them realized. Before the fair, though, in the middle of the war, came the afternoon we began with, and now that you know the shape of the fight you can see it properly. In the early 1890s the money market shook. A great London banking house came close to failure, credit dried up across the Atlantic, and a good many American companies that had been growing on borrowed money found the borrowing stopped. Westinghouse was one of them. He had expanded hard, he had bought patents and companies, he had built a national business in a few years, and he was carrying debt. And the men who held the debt came to him with a reorganization plan and a condition attached. They had looked at his books, and they had found sitting in them an obligation that horrified them, an open-ended royalty of $2.50 for every horsepower of alternating current capacity his company would ever install, payable to one private individual, forever. They told him that no bank would advance him another dollar while that promise stood. It had to be bought out or cancelled, and there was no money to buy it out. And Westinghouse, who could have sent a lawyer, went himself to New York and told the truth to the man's face. He explained the position and did not soften it. He said that if the royalty stood, the company would be taken out of his hands and broken up, and that the new owners would be men with no attachment to alternating current at all, and that in that case the system might well be shelved. The tall man in the dark coat listened to all of it. He asked whether the company would be saved if the royalty went, and was told it would. He asked whether Westinghouse would then be able to carry on and give the world the system, and was told that he would, and that he intended to. Then he said the thing that people who study his life keep coming back to, which is that Westinghouse had been the one man on earth who had backed him when the entire industry was against him, who had refused to give up when they told him it was a failure, who had stood by him when others laughed. And then he asked for the contract and tore it into pieces, and told the manufacturer to keep his company and give the world his system. There was a settlement of sorts some years later, a lump sum, a couple of $100,000, paid to clear up the accounts. It is a rounding error against what the royalty would have produced. He was not a fool about it. He knew exactly what he was destroying. He had been poor within living memory, and he would be poor again. And he had already had 2 companies taken away from him by financiers, and there is no version of this in which he did not understand the arithmetic. He did it anyway, because the alternative was that his system, the one he had carried whole in his head since a sunset in a park in Budapest, might be shelved by bankers, and because a man had been decent to him. It is the single most expensive act of gratitude in the industrial history of the world, and it is also, if you want to be hard-headed about it, the reason the system exists at all. If you want to know what it bought, look at the walls of the room you are in. Meanwhile, and this is the part of him people forget, he had already stopped working on alternating current power. He handed it over in 1888 and essentially never returned to it, because to him it was solved, and a solved thing was of no further interest. What had captured him instead, from about 1889 onward, was frequency. He had begun to wonder what happens if you take alternating current and push its rate of reversal up, and then far up, past anything a machine of the period could produce. At 60 reversals in a second you get power. At tens of thousands you get something else. At hundreds of thousands you get a country nobody had visited. He built machines to get there. First mechanical ones, high-speed alternators with many poles, which he pushed until they screamed and flew apart. Then, when mechanics ran out, he invented his way around them with an oscillating circuit, a capacitor discharging through a spark gap into a coil, ringing like a struck bell at a rate no moving part could reach. He wound a second coil around the first with far more turns, loosely coupled, tuned to the same note, and got out of it a pressure that had never been produced by human beings before. Hundreds of thousands of volts at hundreds of thousands of cycles in the second. That machine is called a Tesla coil, and versions of it sat in the ignition system of motor cars, in radio transmitters, in medical apparatus, and in television sets for most of the following century, and it still turns up in every science museum on Earth, throwing purple lightning at a caged crowd. And when he took that pressure into his own hands, he found the extraordinary fact that made him famous. At those speeds, current no longer wants to go through the body. It runs on the surface of things, and it will pass over a man's skin without harming him, and it will make the air around him glow, and it will light a lamp held in his bare hand with nothing connected to it. He tested this on himself, repeatedly, deliberately, and once nearly killed himself getting the conditions wrong, and then went back and did it again. On the 20th of May in 1891, at Columbia College, he gave the lecture that made his name outside the trade. It ran for 3 hours. He stood in front of the American Institute of Electrical Engineers and showed them phenomena that none of them had ever seen. Tubes with no wires in them glowing when he walked into a room where a high-frequency field was standing. Long glass rods lit up like torches, sheets of light, and at the end himself, taking the terminals in his hands, with fire streaming from his fingertips, standing perfectly calm and talking as he did it. Somewhere in the middle of that lecture he also described, almost in passing, an idea that would occupy the rest of his life. He suggested that if energy could be made to jump across a laboratory without wires, it could be made to jump across a continent, and that the Earth itself, the whole planet, might be used as one gigantic conductor, set ringing at its own natural rate, so that a receiver anywhere on its surface could draw power out of it. He was 35, and he had just proposed in public wireless power for the entire world. 2 months later, in July of 1891, he became an American citizen. He kept the certificate in the drawer of his desk for the rest of his life, and told visitors that he valued it above every scientific honour he had received. And that was not a polite remark, since by the end he had a great many honours, and was fairly casual about most of them. In 1892 the invitations came from Europe, and he crossed back over the ocean he had arrived on with 4 cents, this time in a first-class cabin, to lecture in London to the Institution of Electrical Engineers and then to the Royal Institution, which is the room where Faraday had worked and where the seats are steep and the audience is the scientific establishment of Britain. He did his phenomena in that room. The old men of British physics, who had seen everything, came down from their seats afterwards and crowded round the table like students. Lord Kelvin, who had been sceptical of alternating current in print, changed his mind on the spot and stayed a supporter for the rest of his life. They asked him to stay and repeat it, and he refused, because he had another engagement, but they persuaded him to go into Faraday's own laboratory and drink a bottle of whiskey that had been laid down by Faraday himself and was opened only for particular guests. Then Paris, and the same performance, and the same effect. And then, in the middle of the tour, a telegram came from home to say that his mother was dying. He went at once, travelling for days, and reached Gospic in time. He sat with her, and for several nights he did not leave the house, and then, being what he was, he collapsed himself and was put to bed in a room in a building nearby. Worn out with travel and grief, and the sort of exhaustion that had been chasing him since Budapest. And in the small hours, he had what he always afterwards described as the only genuinely inexplicable experience of his life. He dreamed or saw a cloud carrying angelic figures, and one of them had his mother's features, and she was looking at him and moving away, and he woke with the absolute certainty that she had died. He looked at the clock. In the morning they came to tell him, and the time they gave him was the time he had noted. He spent years afterwards trying to explain it to himself in physical terms, and eventually decided it must have been a picture assembled by his own overloaded nervous system out of things he had seen the day before. And he refused all his life to accept any supernatural account of it, because he did not believe in the supernatural, and because he had a horror of being claimed by people who did. But he told the story often, and it clearly never stopped bothering him. She was buried in Lika. He stayed a few weeks, spoke to great crowds in Belgrade and Zagreb, was received like a returning prince by a people who had never had a scientist of world rank before, and then he came back to New York, and did not go home again for the rest of his life. He was 36 years old, and he had, by any measure, everything the system was winning. The lectures had made him a celebrity in 3 countries. He had money, a stream of it, and he spent it in a way that was entirely characteristic, which is to say almost none of it on property, and almost all of it on apparatus and hotel bills. He never owned a house. He never owned any land. He lived in hotels, the best ones, from that point until his death. And he moved when the bills grew too painful, and he worked in rented laboratories. Between the fair and the end of the century, he was the most glamorous scientific figure in America. He was 6'2" and thin to the point of alarm, and he dressed with an exactness that people found either magnificent or slightly comic. Dark formal coat, high stiff collar, silk cravat, spats, gloves that he changed constantly and threw away after a week. He would not eat with a napkin that had been used, and required a fresh pile of them at every meal, 18 of them, because 18 divides by 3. He calculated the volume of his soup and the cubic contents of his coffee cup before drinking, and if the calculation was interrupted, the meal was spoiled. He would not touch another person's hair. He could not bear round shapes, and would leave a room rather than sit near a woman wearing pearls. He ate alone, most nights, at a reserved table at Delmonico's and later at the Waldorf, at the same hour, with the food prepared in a specified way, and he tipped extravagantly, and the staff loved him. And he could be, when he chose, the finest company in New York. He had an enormous memory for poetry and could recite whole works. He was funny in a dry way. He knew everyone. The one great friendship of his life began in this period, and it was with a married couple, an editor and poet who ran one of the leading magazines of the age, and his wife, a warm, quick, extremely charming woman who became, as far as anybody can tell, the person he loved. There was never anything improper about it. There was never anything improper about anything, because he had decided in his 20s that he would not marry, on the grounds that an inventor must give everything to his work, and that a wife deserved better than what would be left, and he stuck to that decision as he stuck to all his decisions. But the letters between him and that household ran for 40 years, and he dined there constantly, and he taught them Serbian poetry, and the wife's letters to him grew wistful and then plaintive over the decades, in a way that is painful to read now, and his replies were always affectionate, always courteous, and always about 6 inches further away than she wanted. Through that house he met the writers, and among the writers he met the one who mattered most to him, a white-haired humorist from the Mississippi, whose books he had read as a sick boy in Gospic during the cholera year, and whom he was convinced had saved his life then by making him want to live. They became genuine friends. The writer came to the laboratory constantly and adored it. He would stand for hours watching the coils. And it was in that laboratory that the famous and slightly disreputable practical joke occurred, involving the mechanical oscillator. The oscillator was a small reciprocating engine, driven by compressed air, mounted so that it shook at a very precisely controllable rate. He was interested in resonance, in the fact that a small push repeated at exactly the right rate will build an enormous motion, the way a child on a swing goes higher and higher with almost no effort. He would clamp the little machine to something and tune it, and watch the something begin to move. He put the writer on a vibrating platform driven by the oscillator, told him it was excellent for the health, and let him stand there enjoying himself while he counted quietly, knowing exactly what the vibration was going to do to a man's digestion, and after a couple of minutes his friend left the platform at speed and in silence, and found the facilities at the back of the building. He told that story for 40 years. There is a much larger version of the resonance story which he told himself, and which has grown considerably in the telling since. He said that he once clamped the oscillator to a steel supporting column of the building on Houston Street, or the one before it, and set it running while he went on with other work, and that the whole structure began to resonate, and that furniture moved and plaster came down, not only in his building, but in the ones next door, and that the police, who had a station nearby, arrived at a run, and that he took a hammer and smashed the little machine before they came through the door, and then explained to them innocently that they must have felt an earth tremor. He also claimed, in an interview when he was much older and enjoying himself, that with a device of that kind, small enough to put in a coat pocket, given enough time and the right rate, he could bring down any bridge or building on Earth, and that he could split the planet like an apple if he had a place to stand and a few months to wait. He said such things with a completely straight face and a small enjoyment in his eyes, and reporters wrote them down without the small enjoyment. And by the middle of the next century the small enjoyment had disappeared entirely, and the earthquake machine had become a fact. What is actually true, and is much more interesting, is the underlying idea, which is that he had understood tuning years before anybody else, and that everything he did afterwards, wireless included, came out of the realization that if you make two things ring at the same rate, they will talk to each other across a distance and ignore everything else. That is how a radio finds a station. He worked it out on a shaking iron column in Manhattan while making a novelist run for the lavatory. It is worth slowing down here to say how he actually worked, because it was unlike anybody else in his profession, and it explains both the height of what he reached and the depth of what he fell into. He did not keep a bench covered in half-finished attempts. He did not, as a rule, build a model to see whether an idea was any good, because to him building a model to test an idea was an admission that you had not finished thinking. He would take a problem and hold it, sometimes for years, turning it in the internal space he had built as a frightened child in Gospic. And he would not put a hand on a piece of metal until the machine was complete in there, running, worn in, with its faults already found and corrected. Then he would go into the shop and instruct his men in exact dimensions, from memory, without drawings, and they would make it, and it would work. His assistants, who were skilled and patient and mostly went unremembered, learned to accept this. There was a bohemian machinist who came to him young and stayed for decades and eventually ran the coils at Colorado, and a quiet, meticulous manager who kept the books and the correspondence and who went on writing to him with respect long after there was any laboratory left to manage, and there was a shifting crew of glassblowers and winders who could make anything. They worked at night, because he worked at night. He arrived in the late morning, worked through the afternoon and evening, sent them home and stayed on alone until 3 or 4 in the morning, and slept, he insisted, about 2 hours, with occasional longer collapses to make it up. He was fastidious about the shop, and would not tolerate an untidy bench. And he could not bear anybody standing behind him. He kept the temperature high. He tested every piece of new apparatus on himself first, and a few evenings a month he opened the doors and gave a performance, because the money came from people who had to be shown. He would invite 10 or 15 guests, actors and financiers and writers and their wives, up the stairs into a long dark room, and he would stand in the middle of it and hand round wireless lamps that glowed in their hands, and let sheets of blue fire play off his fingertips, and light the whole room from a single tube standing on a table with no wires at all, and he did it with the timing of a man who had thought about timing. And then the guests would go down the stairs into a Manhattan streetlet in that decade, mostly by gas, and go home and tell everybody. It is easy to be sniffy about the showmanship. It was also, in a very direct way, how a system got built, because the men who signed the cheques for Niagara had stood in that room. The other thing to say about him in those years, and it is the thing that has made him a folk hero to generations that never saw a coil, is that he could not stop describing the future, and he was startlingly, unnervingly often right. Not in a vague way, in detail, in print, decades early, in interviews and articles that anyone can read now. He described, before the end of the last century, a world in which a person could carry an instrument in a pocket, no larger than a watch, and speak into it, and be heard by another person anywhere on the surface of the earth, and see them as well as hear them, and receive news and music and pictures on it. And he said that the whole planet would be turned by this into a single brain, with every part of it in instant contact with every other part. He described sending photographs across the ocean without wires. He described machines that would do the work of men and would be given senses and judgment of their own. He described taking nitrogen out of the air with electricity to feed the soil and end hunger, which is now done at an industrial scale and feeds roughly half the people alive. He described smelting iron with electric power, and the coming of aircraft that would fly above the weather, and, in one interview in old age that reads very strangely today, a future in which women would come to dominate the professions and the governments, and would not be judged by their appearance, and in which the human race would deliberately manage the whole energy budget of the planet or else be managed by it. He also, it has to be said, predicted a number of things that have not happened and probably will not, and he predicted several of them in the same paragraph as the ones that came true, which is exactly why prophecy is a poor way to judge a man and engineering is a good one. But that habit of mind, the refusal to draw the boundary of the possible where everybody else drew it, is the same habit that made him stand up in a lecture room in Graz and tell a professor that a machine ought to be built without a commutator. It won him the modern world, and it cost him everything he had, and all of it, the demonstrations and the predictions and the coils and the notes and the 12 years of accumulated work, was in the long room on the upper floors of a building on South Fifth Avenue, on the night of the 13th of March, 1895. The laboratory at that time occupied the upper floors of a building on South Fifth Avenue, in what is now the south of the island, and it was, by every description we have, one of the most remarkable rooms in the world. It ran the depth of the building, with tall windows, and it contained the accumulated apparatus of 6 of the most productive years any inventor has ever had. The high-frequency alternators, the coils, hundreds of glass bulbs of his own design, phosphorescent tubes, motors of every size, the oscillators, and, in cabinets and on shelves, the notes, everything he had done since Liberty Street, the plans, the calculations, the results of thousands of experiments, and, most importantly, the work in progress on wireless transmission, which by the beginning of 1895 was very far advanced and about to be demonstrated over a distance of 50 miles. He had almost no duplicates and very few witnesses, because he did not keep the sort of dated and countersigned notebooks that his rivals kept, since he carried most of the work in his head and considered paper an inconvenience. On the night of the 13th of March, 1895, a fire started in the basement of that building. It was not his fire. It began in the ground floor premises of a dry cleaning business, and it went up the light well like a chimney, and by the time the engines arrived the upper floors were beyond saving. He was not there. He had gone home to his hotel around midnight, as he did. The night watchman got out. Nothing else did. When he arrived in the morning, the building had fallen into its own cellar, and there was a hole in the block filled with steaming brick, and the only thing recovered from 4 floors of his life's work was some twisted metal. It was uninsured. He had let the policy go, or had never taken one out, and the accounts differ, and the effect is the same. In one night he lost his apparatus, his records, his wireless work, his prototypes, everything except what was inside his skull. He stood in the street for a while, and then he went to his rooms and did not come out for several days, and a doctor was called, and the newspapers, which loved him, printed the story on their front pages with genuine grief. One editorial said that the destruction was not the loss of one man's property, but of the world's, and that it had set the progress of electrical science back by years. He himself, when he finally spoke, said only that he was in too much pain to talk about it, and that he would begin again. And he did, but something in him had been damaged that did not repair. He was 38, and for the rest of his life the work in front of him had to be rebuilt from a place he had already reached once. There is an argument, and I think it is a strong one, that the fire is the true turning point of his life, more than any business betrayal, because everything before it was completed and everything after it was interrupted. Money came, and quickly, because his name was still gold. A financier of considerable weight advanced him $40,000 and took shares in return, and helped him find and fit out a new laboratory at 46 East Houston Street, a few streets away, and by the following year he was working again, in a long room with a machine shop at one end, with a staff of loyal and mostly anonymous men. Among them a machinist who stayed with him for decades, and a young bohemian assistant who ran his coils and at Colorado would help him make lightning. He was never again quite as rich as he had been, and never again quite as unguarded. He rebuilt the coils and the alternators and the wireless apparatus from memory in about a year, which is a fair demonstration of what that memory was worth. And within weeks of getting the new laboratory running he was handed, by accident, one of the great scientific discoveries of the century, and gave it away. In the last days of 1895, a German professor announced that he had found a new kind of ray, produced in a vacuum tube, which passed through solid matter and left an image on a photographic plate, and he published a picture of the bones of a living hand. The world went mad for it in a matter of weeks, and in New York a tall, thin man read the announcement and felt his stomach drop, because he realized at once what had happened to him. He had been making photographs in his own laboratory for 2 or 3 years using his own high vacuum tubes, and a number of them had come out ruined, fogged, marked with shadows he could not account for, and he had assumed a fault in his plates or a leak of ordinary light, and he had written the failures off and gone on with something more interesting. He had had the discovery in a drawer, and had not stopped to look at it, and his notes and his damaged plates, which would have established at least a share of priority, had gone into the cellar with everything else in the March fire. He did not sulk. Within weeks of the German announcement he had built better tubes than anybody in the field, running at far higher pressures than his colleagues could reach, and he was producing shadow pictures of extraordinary quality, images of a human skull through the whole thickness of the head, of the bones of a foot inside a shoe, of the outline of a rib cage, at distances of 40 feet from the tube, which was unheard of. He sent them to the German professor generously with a letter of congratulation, and made no claim of priority at all. He then did something rarer. He noticed that the rays were hurting people. He observed swelling and inflammation and hair loss, and in one case a burn on his own leg that took a long time to heal, and he warned about it in print, repeatedly in 1896 and 1897, while much of the medical profession was cheerfully placing patients under the tubes for half an hour at a time, and shoe shops were preparing, over the following decades to install the machines for measuring children's feet. He recommended distance, short exposures, and a shield of metal between the operator and the tube. He was, in that one respect, 20 years ahead of the profession, and it cost several hundred early radiologists their hands and eventually their lives that he was not listened to. He also, characteristically, gave the whole subject up as soon as it became fashionable, because the crowd had arrived and the interesting country was elsewhere. And the elsewhere was wireless. It is worth being careful here, because this is the part of his life that generates the most heat and the most nonsense. He did not invent radio as one act on one afternoon, and neither did anybody else. And the arguments about it are mostly arguments about what the word means. What he did do, and did before anyone, was to work out and patent the essential machinery of tuned wireless transmission. As early as 1893, in a lecture delivered in St. Louis to an audience of 4,000 people who paid to get in, he set up a transmitter at one end of a hall and a receiver at the other with no connection between them, and made the receiver respond. It is the first public demonstration of wireless communication anywhere. Then, in 1897, he filed the patents that mattered, granted in 1900, describing a system with 4 tuned circuits, 2 at the sending end and 2 at the receiving end, all ringing at the same rate, so that one transmitter could be picked out from another, and the message would not be smothered. Without tuning, wireless is a room full of people shouting. With tuning, it is a telephone. Every radio set ever built uses the principle, and the man who described it first described it in a small laboratory on Houston Street, while the world was still arguing about whether messages could cross a river. While all of that was going on, upstate, 100 miles beyond the reach of any direct current station ever built, men were digging the largest hole in the Western Hemisphere, and the argument he had won in Chicago was being turned into stone. Niagara Falls had been an obsession of his since childhood, and this is one of those details that sounds invented and is not. As a boy in Gospic, he had seen an engraving of the falls in a book, a picture of an enormous curtain of water falling into a gorge, and he had told his uncle that one day he would go to America and put a great wheel under that water. The uncle, quite sensibly, said nothing. 30 years later, a commission was formed with the intention of doing exactly that. It was an international body of the most eminent engineers alive, and it was set up with money from a group of financiers, and its task was to decide how the power of the falls, which everybody agreed was the largest concentration of usable energy on the continent, could be captured and moved to where people lived. The chief difficulty was not capturing it. Water wheels were old. The difficulty was that the nearest city of any size, Buffalo, was 22 miles away, and every existing method of moving power that distance was hopeless. Compressed air lost most of itself in the pipes. Ropes and cables and shafting were a joke at that range. Direct current would arrive as a whisper. The commission took years, considered proposals from all over the world, including several beautifully engineered systems of pneumatic tubes, and offered prizes for schemes. And in the end, in the middle of the 1890s, it made the decision that ratified everything. The falls would be harnessed with alternating current, in the polyphase form, at his frequency, on his patents. The contracts for the generators went to Westinghouse. The transmission and distribution work went in large part to General Electric, which is a nice illustration of how quickly the war ended once there was money to be made, since General Electric had to build the line under license to the very patents its founder had spent 6 years calling a delusion. What they built is still there and is still worth describing, because it was one of the wonders of the age. They cut a tunnel 2 miles long through solid rock beneath the town, big enough to drive a train through to carry the spent water back to the river below the falls. They sank a wheel pit 170 feet deep. Down at the bottom, water taken from above the falls dropped through great steel penstocks onto turbines, and the turbines turned vertical shafts 140 feet long, running all the way up to the generator floor, where 10 enormous alternators, each rated at 5,000 horsepower, stood in a stone powerhouse designed to look like a cathedral, with round arched windows and a long calm roofline, because the men who built it understood that they were building a temple whether they said so or not. The first of those generators was set turning in the summer of 1895, and the current went first to a local carborundum works and to the aluminium furnaces beside the river, and then, on the 16th of November in 1896, at midnight, a switch was closed, and alternating current from Niagara Falls travelled 22 miles down copper wire on wooden poles and arrived in the city of Buffalo, where the streetcars began to run on it, and the mills, and eventually the houses. Buffalo went slightly mad. There were fireworks and speeches. What it meant was simple and enormous. Power no longer had to be made where it was used. A river in one county could turn a lathe in another, and a mountain could light a town, and the factory no longer had to be built at the waterfall, and within 30 years that single fact had rearranged the map of every industrial country on Earth. He went up to the falls himself in the summer of 1896 and was taken through the powerhouse, and stood on the generator floor with his hand on a machine the size of a cottage that existed because of a drawing he had made in the dust with a stick, and by every account he was, briefly, entirely happy. At the banquet afterwards he made a short and rather formal speech in which he said that this was the beginning, that the falls had shown what could be done, and that in time all the energy of the world would be gathered in this way, and that he hoped he might live to see the day when power would flow without any wire at all. Within a year or two, half the electrical power generated in the United States came from machines built on the 7 patents of 1888. Within 20 years it was effectively all of it. He was 40, and he had already done the thing that would put his name in every textbook, and he had ceased to be interested in it, and had turned his whole attention to the thing that would ruin him. But before we walk him into that, there is one more triumph, and it is the strangest and most modern thing he ever did, and it happened in a boat pond in the middle of Manhattan. In the autumn of 1898, the first electrical exhibition was held in the old Madison Square Garden, and he took a large tank of water into the hall, and floated in it a small vessel about 4 feet long, iron-hulled, with a rounded superstructure like an overturned boat, 2 propellers, a rudder, a battery, a set of running lights, and a slim vertical rod for an aerial. There was nobody in it, and nothing attached to it. He stood at the side of the tank at a box with a lever, and the crowd was invited to ask questions, and he answered them by making the boat obey. It turned left, it turned right, it went astern, it stopped. Its lights flashed on and off in reply. When somebody asked it the cube root of a number, the lights blinked out the answer, which was a nice piece of theatre since the answer came from the man at the box, though the audience could not see how. Somebody suggested that a trained monkey was hidden inside it, or a small man, which he found delightful. What it actually was, and what he patented that year, was the first radio-controlled vehicle in the history of the world. He called the whole field telautomatics, and he had a set of tuned circuits in the hull so that a signal at the right rate, and only at the right rate, would work the relays, and a later version had a mechanical arrangement requiring several correct frequencies in a sequence before it would obey, which is, in essence, the first encryption of a radio control link. Invented in 1899 because he was worried about interference and about a rival taking his boat away from him. He tried to sell the idea to the United States Navy as a torpedo that could be steered from shore, a weapon that would make war so instantly decisive, he argued, that nations would stop having wars. The Navy was polite and did nothing, on the grounds that it was too fanciful. 42 years later, the same idea, matured, was flying off aircraft carriers. He also said something at the time about that little boat that almost nobody in the hall understood, and it is worth ending this section on. He said that it was not merely a machine that carried out orders, but that it borrowed the mind of its operator, and that he had conceived of it as the first of a race of mechanisms which would do the labour of the world, and that a machine could be given senses of its own, and the capacity to respond to its surroundings without being told, and that this was not a distant fantasy, but an engineering problem. He was describing, in a hall full of people watching a toy boat, the entire idea of the robot, half a century before the word was in common use. In the spring of 1899, he went west. He had a plan that could not be carried out in a rented room in Manhattan, because it required more space, thinner air, drier ground, and far more electrical pressure than any city would tolerate. And a friend who was a lawyer in Colorado offered him land for nothing on the prairie outside Colorado Springs, at 6,000 feet at the foot of the mountains, in a place where the summer storms are among the most spectacular on the continent. The local power company offered him electricity free of charge, out of civic pride. A wealthy backer put up money. And so at 43, he packed up his assistants and went out to the high plains and built a wooden shed. It was not a small shed. It stood about 60 feet square, with a barn-like roof that could be rolled back, and out of the centre of it rose a wooden mast 142 feet high, with a copper ball 3 feet across on the top. Inside, filling most of the floor, he built the biggest resonant transformer that had ever been made, a coil 75 feet in diameter, running around the walls of the building like a fence, with a second, smaller secondary inside it, and at the centre, an extra coil that he could raise and lower. The whole thing was designed as a tuned circuit, whose partner was not another coil, but the planet. That was the idea, and it deserves a moment of your attention, because it is either one of the most beautiful thoughts in the history of engineering, or one of the most beautiful mistakes, and a century later people are still arguing about which. He had concluded that the Earth is a conductor, a very large ball of it, and that like any conductor it has a natural rate at which it will ring, and that if you strike it electrically at exactly that rate, from a station connected firmly to the ground, you will set up standing waves in the planet itself, hills and valleys of electrical pressure spread out over the whole globe, stationary like the pattern of a plucked string. And if that were so, then anybody, anywhere, could push a rod into the ground, tune a small receiver to the same note, and take out of the earth as much power as they liked, or a message. No wires, no poles, no meters, which is the detail the money noticed. He spent 9 months out there, from June of 1899 to the beginning of 1900. And he kept a diary, day by day, with drawings, which survived and has been published, and it is the most detailed record of any part of his working life. The neighbours were told to stay away. There was a sign on the door of the shed warning of danger, with a line from Dante about abandoning hope, which was his idea of a joke. Nights were the working time. He would take the pressure up in stages, tuning, listening to the note of the spark, and the sound of it could be heard for miles. A hard rhythmic cracking rolling out over the prairie, and people in the town would come out of their houses to watch the sky over the hills flicker. What he achieved there physically is not in dispute, because the local power company's records support it, and so do the photographs. He generated the highest voltages that had ever been produced by human beings, in the region of 12 million volts, and drew from the top of that mast bolts of artificial lightning over 130 feet long, forked and branching and blue-white, cracking with a report that was heard 15 miles away. Horses in the streets of the town bolted. Sparks jumped from the ground to the feet of people walking near the shed, and butterflies caught in the field were seen wheeling in circles with blue fire on their wings, which he wrote down as calmly as everything else. The photograph that made his legend was taken there, and it is a fake, and he admitted it cheerfully. He had the camera exposed first for the lightning storm inside the shed, and then, with the machine off, for himself sitting quietly in a chair reading a book at the foot of it, and combined the two on one plate and gave it out to the world. He wanted the world to see what it felt like, and a true photograph would not have shown it. One night in July he took the pressure higher than he ever had, and the arc ran, and the shed shook, and then everything went black. Not just his building, the town. He had drawn so much that the dynamo at the power station burned out and the whole of Colorado Springs was in darkness. The power company was extremely unhappy and told him he could rewind their generator himself if he wanted his electricity back, and he did, with his own men, and the free supply was not free after that. But before the lights failed, in that instant of highest pressure, He had seen something on his instruments that convinced him he was right. He had a receiver arranged to detect returning waves, and as the storms of that summer moved across the plains and away from him, he watched the strength of the signals from each departing storm fall. And then, as the storm receded further, rise again, and fall, and rise, in a pattern of maxima and minima that could mean, if you already believed it, that the electrical disturbance was travelling round the curve of the Earth and coming back and standing in place. He wrote in his diary that he had established the existence of stationary waves in the planet, and that no doubt could remain, and from that day the whole remainder of his life was built on that conclusion. Modern physicists will tell you that the Earth does indeed have resonances at very low frequencies in the cavity between the ground and the ionosphere, discovered and measured properly 60 years later, and that he was in the right neighbourhood and probably not measuring what he thought he was measuring, and that free global power by that route does not work because the energy spreads and thins the way energy always does. He was not wrong about the resonance, he was wrong about the bill. And then there were the signals. In the small hours of a night in that same summer, alone in the shed with a sensitive receiver running and the transmitter off, listening for the crackle of distant storms, he heard something else. 3 faint regular impulses, repeating 1, 2, 3, in a rhythm that no lightning discharge makes, coming and going in a way that appeared to follow the setting of a particular planet below the horizon. He sat with it for a long time. He was extremely careful and rather frightened of what he was thinking, and he did not publish anything for months. And then he wrote it, in a magazine article, and said that he had received in the high stillness of the Colorado desert faint and steady signals whose meaning he could not determine, and that the feeling that came over him while he listened was that he was present at something of enormous consequence, and that he could not rid himself of the conviction that they were the greetings of one planet to another. The reaction was, predictably, split down the middle. The public loved it. A serious portion of the scientific press decided at that moment that he had gone over the edge, and never entirely came back, and the phrase came into use, in some quarters, that his talent had become his misfortune. The likeliest explanation now, with everything we know, is that he was hearing natural radio emissions from the sun or from the magnetic field of a giant planet which are real, which do repeat, and which nobody on Earth had ever detected before, because nobody else had a receiver of that sensitivity, on that ground, at that altitude, in 1900. If that is what it was, then he did not receive a message from another world, but he did become the first radio astronomer in history, 40 years before the field had a name, and was laughed at for it. He came back to New York in January of 1900, with a diary full of drawings, a mast to be dismantled and sold for scrap to pay a local bill, a burned-out generator on his conscience, and a total, unshakable certainty that he could give the entire human race light, heat, power and communication, everywhere on the surface of the Earth, for practically nothing, if somebody would only build him the transmitter. He was 43 years old. He had about 6 years of good fortune left. He needed money, a great deal of it, and to get it he did something he was very good at, and had not done for a while, which was to write. In the summer of 1900, one of the great magazines of the age published a long, strange, magnificent article of his, running to many thousands of words, about the increase of human energy, in which he laid out the whole of his philosophy, that humanity is a mass in motion, that all our problems reduce to adding to its energy or reducing the forces retarding it. That war would end when machines fought instead of men, that the sun's power falling on the world was there to be gathered, that iron would eventually be smelted with electricity and nitrogen taken from the air to feed the soil, and, in the last section, that he had built a machine in the mountains of Colorado which proved that power and intelligence could be sent through the Earth to any point, on its surface. It was reprinted everywhere, and it did what he wanted, because it was read by the most powerful private individual in the United States. John Pierpont Morgan was in his 60s, a mountain of a man with a famously ruined nose and a stare that made cabinet ministers stammer, and he was not a technologist. He was the person who financed technology, and who assembled industries, and who had, at that period, more direct control over the American economy than the government did. He invited the inventor to his house on Madison Avenue and listened and asked what it would cost, and in the spring of 1901 he advanced $150,000 for the construction of a wireless station on the coast, in exchange for a controlling interest in the patents that would come out of it. There is a detail here that determined everything. What the inventor described to Morgan, and what Morgan wrote the check for, was a commercial wireless telegraph station, a way of sending messages across the Atlantic faster and cheaper than the undersea cables, which Morgan had reason to be interested in. What the inventor actually intended to build, and had intended from the beginning, was the World Power Transmitter, the first node of a global system that would broadcast electricity to anyone with a receiver, free. He did not lie about it exactly. It was in the article, in print for anybody to read. But he did not lead with it in the drawing room on Madison Avenue, and when it emerged in the correspondence later, the relationship never recovered. He bought 200 acres of potato field on the north shore of Long Island, near a place he named Wardenclyffe after the man who sold him the land, and he engaged the most fashionable architect in New York, a friend from the dinner tables, to design the laboratory building, a long, low, elegant brick structure with a chimney and tall windows that would not look out of place today. And behind it he began the tower. It was designed to stand 187 feet high, an octagonal timber lattice, tapering, with a great mushroom-shaped dome of steel at the top 55 feet across, and beneath it, driven down into the ground, an iron shaft going 120 feet into the earth with 16 radiating tunnels bored outward at the bottom, because, as he explained to visitors, transmitting into the air was not enough. He said the earth had to be gripped, and then, while the tower was going up slowly on the potato field, on a December afternoon in 1901, a young Italian marquise, sitting in a draughty room in Newfoundland, with a kite holding up an aerial, announced that he had heard, faintly through the static, 3 dots sent from Cornwall, and that a signal had crossed the Atlantic. It has been argued ever since whether he really heard it that day. It does not matter in the least, because the world believed it, and the money believed it, and a man who had spent a few £1,000s and used a simple apparatus had apparently just done the thing for which another man was digging tunnels under a potato field and spending a fortune. The response was characteristic and, in hindsight, disastrous. He did not hurry. He did not send a quick message across the ocean to plant a flag, which he could very probably have done. He went to Morgan and asked for more money, and explained that the plan had grown, and that what he was building was not a telegraph at all, but a world system that would broadcast news, music, stock prices, pictures, time signals, and, above all, power to every corner of the earth, and that the tower on Long Island was the first of many. Morgan, who had paid for a telegraph, wrote back the sort of letter that men like Morgan write. He observed that the arrangement had been fixed, and that he did not care to make any further advances. There followed several years of letters. They are hard reading. The inventor's letters begin with dignity and detailed argument, and grow, over months and then years, more pressing, and then desperate, and then something worse than desperate, and the replies grow shorter, and eventually the replies are written by a secretary. He kept building anyway. He sold what he could. He borrowed from friends, from his own staff, from the hotel. His housekeeper at Wardenclyffe went unpaid. Suppliers took liens on the property. He put the tower up regardless, and it stood on the shore in eventual completion, an enormous skeletal thing visible from the Sound, and he did fire it, in 1903, on at least one night. People in the villages nearby saw the top of it crowned with light, and lightning walking off the dome and out into the sky, and they came out into their gardens to look at the sky flickering over the trees. There is an account of that night that says the flashes could be seen for many miles, and that the air smelled of storms. It was the last time it ran. In 1905 the money finally stopped altogether. His polyphase patents, the golden ones, had begun to expire that year, and with them went his last dependable income. He had a breakdown of some kind. There is a gap in the record, and he emerged from it thinner, older, and permanently changed. The laboratory closed, the staff went to other work, and a mortgage was taken over the Wardenclyffe property by the owner of a certain grand hotel on Fifth Avenue in settlement of a bill for accommodation that had grown to about $20,000, which is one of the more melancholy facts in the history of engineering. The World Power Station was signed over to pay for a hotel room. In 1917, with the country at war and the tower standing derelict, and rumours going about that enemy agents were using it as a landmark or a signal post, the government suggested it be taken down, and the hotel's owners sold it for scrap. A demolition crew went in with dynamite. The first attempt did not bring it down. The timber frame had been built to hold a load in a hurricane, and it simply absorbed the charge, and they had to come back and do it again, and the second time it came apart and lay in the grass. He was in Chicago when he learned about it, and did not comment publicly. The brick laboratory building stayed standing, and it is still standing, and a very long time later people who cared about him raised money from ordinary donations all over the world, and bought the site so that it could become a museum, which is a happy ending that arrived about 90 years late. He was 50 when the money ended, and he lived another 36 years, which is a very long postscript, and it was not empty, whatever the sadder retellings suggest. He kept an office. He kept working. He kept inventing, and some of what he made in those decades is in use today. He set up as a consulting engineer in a suite of rooms in one commercial building after another as the rents caught up with him, and he took paying work, and he filed patents. And he thought about the things that had always interested him, which were fluids and rotation and the elegance of doing without parts. The best of the late work is the bladeless turbine, which he patented in 1913 and considered in old age his finest single invention. It is a beautiful object. It contains no blades and no buckets. It is a stack of smooth flat discs closely spaced on a shaft in a housing, and steam or air or water is admitted at the rim and spirals inward to the centre, and the discs are dragged round by nothing but the friction and adhesion of the fluid clinging to their faces, and the shaft turns. There is almost nothing in it to break. He built versions that spun at enormous rates and produced remarkable power for their weight, and he demonstrated them, and they impressed everyone who saw them, and they were never commercially adopted, partly because the metallurgy of the period could not make discs that would stay flat at those speeds, and partly because by 1913 the world's power industry was already committed, with billions invested to the bladed steam turbine, and no industry that size turns around for elegance. He also worked on speedometers, on frequency meters, on a machine for measuring the flow of fluids, on the geometry of the aeroplane, and in 1928, at 72 years old, he received his last patent for a flying machine that would take off vertically like a helicopter and then tilt its whole propelling apparatus forward and fly like an aeroplane. It is a tilt-rotor aircraft. It was patented in the year Amelia Earhart first crossed the Atlantic, and the first machines that actually worked on that principle went into military service about 60 years afterwards. The money, however, never came back. And the reason is worth saying plainly, because it is not that his ideas were bad. He was, quite simply, catastrophic at business, in a way that looks almost like a moral position. He would not take a partner he did not respect. He would not build a small version of a big idea to raise the money for the big one. He gave away or failed to defend things that were worth fortunes, and he insisted on perfection in the laboratory when a merely excellent product would have sold. His polyphase patents made other men into dynasties. He signed away the royalty that would have made him one of the richest men alive. He allowed his radio patents to lapse for want of the modest fees to keep them in force, which is how a young Italian marquise with better lawyers and much better financing ended up with the industry, and a Nobel Prize, and the name. Speaking of which, there is the affair of the prize. In November of 1915, a news agency reported that the Nobel Prize for Physics that year would be shared between the two of them, the Serbian and the Italian. The story ran in the newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. It was wrong, and the prize went to a father and son working on the diffraction of X-rays by crystals, and no official announcement had ever been made. But the story stuck, and it grew a second story on top of it, which is that he had refused the prize, out of pride, because he would not share it with a man he considered had taken his work. He gave several evasive and rather grand answers when asked, and he never quite denied the refusal, and it seems most likely that there was never anything to refuse. What is certain is that he needed the money the prize would have brought, badly, that year, and did not get it. 2 years later, in 1917, the American Institute of Electrical Engineers offered him its highest honour, the Edison Medal, and here the irony is so heavy that it takes a moment to lift. He said no at first, and said it hard, and told the friend who came to persuade him that they proposed to honour him with a medal bearing the name of a man who had, in his view, done everything possible to take his life's work from him, and that they could give him a hollow decoration and let his descendants have it, while the real substance of his achievement lived in 100 power stations they had never bothered to credit him for. Then he thought about it, and because he was courteous, and because the men offering it were engineers rather than financiers, he accepted. On the evening of the presentation, in a room at the Engineers Club, the officers gathered and could not find him. He had gone. Someone eventually thought to look outside, and he was found around the corner in the back of the public library, in a courtyard, standing in a cloud of pigeons that had settled all over his hat and his shoulders and his outstretched arms, feeding them. He was persuaded to come in and receive the medal, and gave a long and gracious speech, and went back to the birds. The birds are not a joke, and they are not a symptom, or at least not only a symptom. They are the last love of his life, and they need to be told properly. He had kept pigeons in the barn as a boy in Smiljan. In New York, from middle age onward, he fed them every day of his life, in the parks and squares near whatever hotel he was living in. And when he became too ill or too old to walk out, he paid messenger boys to take seed to the same places at the same hours, and he had special mixtures made up, and he brought injured birds back to his rooms and kept them in baskets, and had a carpenter build wicker cages, and nursed broken wings with splints of his own design, and let them fly around the room. Hotel managers complained. He moved hotels. And among the thousands there was one particular white pigeon, with light grey tips on her wings, and about her he said, in old age, to a man who wrote it down, the most naked sentence he ever uttered in public. He said that he loved that pigeon as a man loves a woman, and that she loved him, and that as long as he had her there was a purpose to his life. The word he used, and used deliberately, was love, and the man he said it to understood that he was not being metaphorical, and did not make fun of him, and neither should we. The last decades ran in a long, slow diminishing curve, and they had a shape to them, a routine, and there was more dignity in it than the newspapers allowed. He rose early. He walked, 8 or 10 miles a day when he could, always the same routes. He fed the birds at the same corners at the same hours, and the birds knew him and came down to him in clouds. And children in those neighbourhoods knew him too, the tall old foreign gentleman in the old-fashioned clothes who was always followed by pigeons. He read the papers. He answered his correspondence in a beautiful, elaborate hand. He ate one large meal a day at an hour of his choosing, prepared to his instructions, and he had by then given up meat entirely, and lived largely on warm milk, honey and bread, and a vegetable juice he mixed himself, and he claimed the diet would carry him past 130. He moved hotels when the bills grew impossible, which happened several times, and the unpaid bills followed him from one to the next like a small procession, and in at least one case he left a sealed box behind as security, telling the manager it contained a device of immense value that must on no account be opened, and it was opened years later, after his death, and it contained a piece of laboratory apparatus of no particular worth. He was not entirely alone. The two great friends of his middle life died, the poet first and then, in the 1920s, his wife, and he grieved for them properly. His nephew, a diplomat, looked after him at the end. His own government, the newly formed kingdom in the country of his birth, granted him a pension in 1936, a modest annual sum, and it kept him from actual destitution for the rest of his life, and the Westinghouse Company, quietly and without publicity, began paying his hotel bill at the New Yorker and a consulting fee for advice they did not need. Because there were still men in Pittsburgh who remembered what he had done for their founder and who did not intend to let him starve. He never knew, or affected never to know, that the arrangement was charity. And every year, on his birthday, he held a press conference. This began in the 1930s, and it became a fixture of the New York summer. He would book a room at his hotel, lay on a lunch he did not eat, receive the reporters in his formal clothes, and make announcements. And the announcements got wilder each year, and he knew perfectly well that the wildness was what got them printed. And the reporters knew that he knew, and there was a kind of collaboration in it, a very old showman and a room of young men in hats enjoying each other. He announced that he had developed a new form of energy which no one had suspected. He announced a means of transmitting power that would run ships across the ocean. He announced that he had found a way to photograph a thought on the retina. He announced, in his 80th year, that he was in possession of a working principle for what the newspapers immediately called the death ray, and which he insisted on calling teleforce, and which he described as a beam of charged particles projected through an open-ended vacuum tube by a new method, focused so tightly that it would not spread over hundreds of miles, and capable of destroying a fleet of 10,000 aircraft at a distance of 250 miles. And here is the part that never got into the headline. He did not propose it as a weapon of attack. He proposed it as a wall. He said that every country should have one, that the beam should be arranged along a nation's frontier as an invisible barrier that no aeroplane and no army could cross, and that when every border on Earth was made impassable in that fashion, war would simply stop, because it would become impossible and the nations would have to talk. He was almost 80, he had lived through one world war and could see the next one coming for Europe and for the country he had been born in, and his answer to it was a machine that would make attack pointless. He offered the design to several governments. Some of them paid a little attention. Nobody built it, and the physics of doing what he described remains extremely difficult now, with instruments he could not have imagined. The reporters printed the death ray and left out the piece. So the legend grew crooked. The public came to think of him in his last years as a marvellous old wizard who had once done something with electricity and now made pronouncements, and the scientific world had largely stopped listening, and the textbooks in the schools taught the story of electric light without his name in it at all. He was aware of both things and complained about neither, at least not in public. He kept his appointments, he kept feeding the birds, he kept in his room the citizenship certificate in the drawer and a photograph of his mother, and the medals in a box. And then there was the night with the white pigeon, which he told to one writer, and which is the most difficult passage in the whole record, so we will go through it gently, and then we will let him rest. He said that he was in his room, in the dark, one night in the middle of the 1920s, and that she flew in through the open window, as she often did, and that this time he understood immediately that she had come to tell him she was dying. And as he looked at her, he saw a light come out of her eyes. He said, a powerful, blinding light, more intense than any he had ever produced with any machine in any laboratory, and he received the message she had come to give, and then she died in his hands. And he said that at that moment he knew that his life's work was finished. He was 60-something. He lived nearly 20 years more, and he was busy in them, and he was never again, by his own account, the man he had been. It is not a rational story, and he did not offer it as one, and the writer who took it down said that the old man's face while he told it was the face of a man describing the loss of a wife. The others went before him, one at a time, and he outlived nearly everybody in this story, which is its own particular kind of loneliness. The manufacturer from Pittsburgh, the one decent man in the War of the Currents, the one whose contract he had torn up, lost control of his own company in the panic of 1907, exactly as the bankers had always intended. and was pushed out of the business he had founded and died in 1914 at 67 years old, of heart trouble, in a wheelchair, having spent his last years working on a device to make it easier for invalids to get about. The tall Serbian wrote about him afterwards with a warmth he showed to almost nobody else, and said that he had been a lion of a man, that he had stood alone against an entire industry with a system nobody believed in and had won on nothing but nerve, and that the world would not know for a long time what it owed him. It still does not. Particularly, the man from Menlo Park lived on, enormously famous, into the 1930s, and the two of them had long since stopped fighting. They were photographed together, politely, more than once. They served on the same committees. Whatever the arc lamps and the $50,000 joke and the pamphlets and the dogs had been, they had been 40 years earlier, and both men were by then monuments. When Edison died in 1931, the newspapers came round to room after room asking the survivors for a comment, and the man he had once told that alternating current was a delusion gave them a long and careful and quite beautiful assessment. He said that his old employer had had no hobby, cared for no amusement, and lived in disregard of the most elementary rules of health, and that if he had known a little theory, he could have saved himself 90% of his labour. And then he said that Edison's method had nonetheless been so wasteful that an absolutely impossible ground had had to be covered to get anything at all, and that watching him do it had been a pathetic spectacle, and that his success had been extraordinary, and his instinct and common sense so great that he had accomplished by sheer brute force what a proper method would have reached far sooner, and that his effect on the age was without parallel. It is not a generous obituary in the ordinary sense, and it is not a mean one either. It is an accurate one, from the only person alive qualified to write it, and he wrote it about a man who had cost him a great deal. Around him the industry he had made went on growing, and forgot to send him anything. Radio became a business worth hundreds of millions in the 1920s, and there were sets in a majority of American homes by the end of that decade, and the fundamental patents on the tuned circuit that made it possible had lapsed years before for want of a modest fee. Electric power spread out across every developed country until, within his own lifetime, more than 9/10 of the electricity generated in the world was generated, transmitted and used by his methods. He would sometimes remark, without much heat, that he had been given a great deal of honour and very little else, and that this was the ordinary fate of the man who is first, and he would then change the subject, usually to birds. And the country he came from disappeared and was replaced twice while he sat in New York, and then, in the last years, was invaded, and he read the reports from Leica in the newspapers in his hotel room at 85 years old, and made a broadcast to his people in his own language, which had grown rusty in 50 years of English, telling them to hold on. There is a photograph of him from around that time, taken in the New Yorker, and it is worth describing, because it is the last image most people ever see of him. He is sitting upright in a plain chair by a window in a formal dark suit that is a decade or two out of fashion and hangs off him. He is enormously thin. The face is all bone and shadow, the hair white and still combed flat and parted precisely in the centre, the way it had been since Paris. The hands are folded, and the expression is not bitter at all, which is the surprising thing. It is patient. He looks like a man waiting politely for something that is running late. In the autumn of 1937, at 81 years old, walking out at his usual hour to feed the birds near the cathedral, he was struck by a taxicab and thrown to the ground. His back was wrenched badly and 3 of his ribs were broken. He refused to see a doctor, which was consistent, since he had held a low opinion of the profession since a doctor in Budapest had told his family he was dying. He refused to go to a hospital. He took a cab home and lay in his room and would not be examined, and it was months before he was on his feet, and he never really recovered. Some kind of pneumonia followed. From that winter onward he stayed mostly indoors, in room 3327 on the 33rd floor of the Hotel New Yorker. A plain room with a view over the streets, with a wire cage by the window and a stack of papers on the desk, and he sent boys out with the seed. The birds still came to the window ledge. He still worked, in the sense that he still wrote and calculated. He gave one last birthday interview in 1942 at 86, in which he spoke about the war, about the country he had come from being overrun, and about his machine that would have made borders impassable, and he was tired and courteous and made no complaints about anything. Around the turn of that year he told the hotel staff not to disturb him. That was not unusual. He hung the notice on the door, and he expected it to be obeyed, and it was for 2 days. On the morning of the 8th of January 1943, a maid decided that 2 days was long enough, and knocked, and heard nothing, and let herself in. He had died in his sleep on the night of the 7th. The doctor who came recorded the cause as a failure of the heart, and gave his age as 86, and noted that there had been no sign of pain or struggle. The room was in perfect order. The bed was neat. There was, in the end, almost nothing to inventory: some clothes, some correspondence, the boxes of notes, a few honours, a certificate of citizenship in a drawer, and unopened mail, including, it is said, a number of birthday envelopes containing money from admirers that he had never got around to opening. The estate was not enough to cover the debts. And then, within hours of the death being reported, something happened that has kept a whole industry of speculation alive ever since. The federal government sent men to the hotel. The country was at war. An old man had been talking for years about particle beams and death rays and remote-controlled aircraft, and there was, in the files, correspondence between him and various defense departments. So the Office of Alien Property, which had powers over the assets of foreign nationals in wartime, and used them here on a naturalized American citizen who had held that citizenship for 52 years, took possession of everything in the room and everything in the storage warehouses where his older material had been sitting for unpaid bills. Something in the region of 80 trunks and boxes was seized and carted to a warehouse in Manhattan and sealed. A well-regarded electrical engineer from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a man who during the war worked on radar and who happened to be an uncle of a person who would become extremely famous much later, was brought in to examine the papers. He spent 3 days with them and wrote a report saying that the contents were largely speculative and philosophical, that they contained nothing of value to a war effort, and that there was no working model or plan of any death ray in existence. That report exists and can be read. The papers were eventually released to the nephew and shipped to Belgrade, where they are held in a museum devoted to him, and a large portion of them have been published. But the seizure did happen, and the secrecy of the first years did happen, and it is why, to this day, a certain kind of documentary can put an old man's photograph on the screen beside the word suppressed and sell it forever. The funeral was on the 12th of January, at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, which is enormous, and it was full. Something like 2,000 people came. There were Nobel laureates in the pews. There were representatives of the government, of the industry that had grown out of his patents, of 2 royal houses, of the exiled government of his birth country. Messages were read from the President of the United States, and from the First Lady, and from 3 Nobel Prize winners, and one of them called him a great mind and a great heart, and the other said that 100 years from now the world would remember him as the man who first laid a hand on the power that runs everything. 3 Serbian choirs sang. The body was cremated afterwards, and the ashes were eventually placed in a gilded sphere, because he had liked spheres, in the museum in Belgrade, where they are today. And then, 5 months after the funeral, in June of 1943, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down a decision in a long-running case about radio patents. The case had been brought by the Italian Marchise's company against the American government over wartime use of radio equipment, and the government defended itself by attacking the validity of the plaintiff's basic patent. And the court agreed, and it did so by pointing out that the essential elements had already been disclosed and patented years earlier by 2 other men, one of whom was the dead Serbian in room 3327. The court was careful to say it was not awarding anybody anything, and that it was deciding a narrow question about infringement. But the finding is on the record. The fundamental patent for tuned radio transmission was his, filed in 1897, granted in 1900, 4 years before his rivals. He had been dead for 5 months and could not be told. It is the last of the pattern, and by now you will have seen the pattern clearly. Over and over across 86 years, the same sequence. He sees the thing first, whole and complete, years before anybody he builds it, and it works. And then somebody else, better lawyered or better financed, or simply better at being in a room with money, takes it out into the world and puts a name on it. He watched it happen with the Arclight Company, and with the radio, and with a great deal of the wireless work, and he tore up the one contract that would have made him untouchable, and he did it on purpose, for a friend. He was not a victim in the ordinary sense. He was a man who valued being right, and being generous more than he valued being paid, and the world simply took him at his word. For a while after he died, it looked as though the world would simply forget him, and for about 2 decades it very nearly did. The engineers knew, the people who worked in power stations knew. But the schoolbooks told the story of electricity as a story about a laboratory in New Jersey and a man with a bulb, and the tall Serbian was, at best, a footnote with a peculiar personality attached. Then, slowly, it turned. In 1960, 17 years after his death, the international conference that fixes the units of measurement for the whole scientific world met and voted to name the unit of magnetic flux density after him. Which means that ever since, everywhere on Earth, in every language, the strength of a magnetic field is measured in Teslas. The machine that hums inside a hospital scanner is rated in them. The little magnet holding a note to a refrigerator door is a few hundredths of one. It is, if you think about it, exactly the right memorial for the man who spent 6 years being told that a rotating magnetic field was impossible. Because now the world cannot measure magnetism at all without saying his name. Statues went up after that. There is one on the island above the falls at Niagara, showing him seated on top of one of his own machines, reading, "There is one on the Canadian side." There is one in Belgrade and one at Zagreb, and one on a windy overlook above the gorge, and there is his face on banknotes and stamps, and on the side of an airport. His birthday is a day of celebration in more than one country, and the museum in Belgrade holds his ashes and his papers, and in a glass case, the little egg of copper that stands on end and spins. And the actual monument, of course, is not any of those. It is the wall of the room you are lying in. Consider, for a moment, and this is the last piece of thinking I will ask you to do tonight. So let it be a slow one. The electricity in the wiring around you is alternating current, and it reverses itself either 50 or 60 times a second, depending on which country you are in. And the reason it alternates at all, and the reason it can travel from a power station 100 miles away and arrive at your bedside lamp without vanishing into heat on the way, is a system that a 26-year-old man assembled whole in his head while reciting Goethe in a park at sunset. The transformers on the poles outside or humming in the green boxes at the end of the street are in his patents. The generator in the power station, whether it is turned by falling water or by steam or by wind, produces its several currents out of step with one another exactly as he specified. And the motor in your refrigerator, and in the fan, and in the pump that moves the water in your heating, and in the machine that washes your clothes, and in the compressor of an air conditioner, and in a great many of the electric cars now moving quietly along the roads outside, is an induction motor with a rotor that nothing touches, spun by a field that walks around a circle, sparkless, more or less unbreakable, capable of running for 30 years in a dark cupboard while nobody thinks about it once. That is his. All of it is his. There are perhaps 3 or 4 people in the history of the species whose ideas are physically present in every inhabited building on the planet, and he is one of them, and he died owing rent. What are we to make of the man himself, at the end of it? Not a saint, and he would have hated the word. He was vain in a courtly, elaborate way. He could be scathing about rivals. He said things in the last 30 years that he could not support, and he enjoyed the sensation they caused, and he sometimes preferred a beautiful idea to a workable one, and he lost a fortune several times over through a stubbornness he was rather proud of. He carried from the age of 5 to the age of 86 a private conviction that he had been in some way responsible for the death of his brother, and one can trace, if one is inclined to, a whole life of enormous unnecessary labour arranged around it. He could not bear to be touched. He never married and, so far as anyone knows, never had any partner at all. And the closest thing to a love of his life was a bird. And yet, read the letters, read the accounts of the men who worked for him, and what comes off the page is not coldness. His assistants stayed with him for decades on irregular wages and spoke of him afterwards with real affection. He was scrupulous about credit to others in an era when almost nobody was. He warned the world about the danger of a new kind of ray at the height of the fashion for it, at some cost to his own standing, because he had seen it hurt people. He believed, right to the last interview, that the purpose of the whole enterprise, all the coils and the towers and the patents, was to reduce the amount of grinding labour in ordinary human lives. And he said so consistently for 50 years, in the same words, whether he was rich or broke. He wanted to give away the power of the planet for nothing, and he meant it so literally that when a banker declined to fund a system with no meter on it, he was genuinely surprised. He tore up $12 million because a man had been kind to him, and he fed the birds every day, in all weather, until he could not walk out any more, and then paid somebody else to do it. Which is the sort of detail that tells you more about a person than a shelf of patents. So, let us leave him where we started, and let us do it gently, because it is late. Go back to the beginning. A stone house in a mountain village, whitewashed, with a mulberry tree by the door and a wooden barn behind it where the pigeons are asleep in the rafters. It is past midnight on a July night in the middle of the last century but one. A storm is standing directly over the roof, and the lightning is coming so fast that the room is lit almost continuously, and the thunder is rolling from ridge to ridge and coming back. In the low bedroom there is a frightened midwife and a calm mother with hands that have built looms and egg beaters and thread, and there is a newborn boy, and somebody says something about darkness, and somebody else says no. A child of light. Now let it run forward, all of it, very quickly and very quietly, the way a life looks from the far end. The frogs and the June bugs and the bladeless water wheel in the stream. The candles behind the plugged keyhole. The fire engine and the collapsed hose, and the boy carried up the bank on people's shoulders. The thin soup in Karlovac. The 9 months of fever and the promise beside the bed. The sparking commutator in a lecture room in Graz, and the professor explaining, with perfect confidence, that it could never be done. 6 years of carrying an impossible machine. A park in Budapest. A sunset. A line of poetry. A stick drawing in the dust. 4 cents in a pocket at the rail of a ship in New York Harbour. The ditches in the frozen mud. And the foreman who listened. 7 patents in one day. A rotor spinning in front of a room full of engineers with nothing touching it and no spark anywhere. A contract torn in half on a hot afternoon. 100,000 lamps coming on at once across the lagoons of a white city, while a crowd makes a sound they will remember all their lives. A hand resting on a generator the size of a cottage, under Niagara, at 40 years old, on a summer day, entirely happy. Lightning 130 feet long walking off a mast on the high plains, and horses bolting in a town 15 miles away. 3 faint impulses in a headphone in the small hours that nobody on this earth had ever heard before. A wooden tower on a potato field with light on its crown, running once, for one night, watched by farmers standing in their gardens. Then the long quiet years, the walks, the same corners at the same hours, the seed in a paper bag, the birds coming down in clouds around an old man in a black coat. And a tidy room on the 33rd floor with the notice on the door, and the window and the ledge, and no pain at all, It is a good life to fall asleep to, this one, and I hope you have been asleep for some time already. If you are still with me, there is nothing left to do. Let your jaw come loose. Let the breath go all the way out, and let the next one come in by itself without any help from you. The room you are in is quiet, and the lamp beside you, if it is on, is burning on his current, at his frequency, through his transformers, from a station he made possible, and it will keep burning or not burning entirely without your attention. Everything is taken care of. Sleep well. We will light the lamp again tomorrow night for somebody else.